Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is let's start this from the beginning in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 46, Graduation I. Let's start this from the beginning. Graduation I. Itachi ducked beneath the incoming fist while simultaneously throwing his own towards his opponent's guts, only to hit nothing but empty air when Shisui jumped over him to evade the attack before landing behind his back. "You will need more than that to hit me, Itachi." Shisui was laughing, obviously enjoying himself, but that stopped immediately when he was forced to raise his arms in defense against Itachi's mule kick. Even then, the power behind it still threw him backwards, nullifying every advantage his position might have brought him. "I will be fine as long as it's enough to evade your hits as well, won't I?" His opponent merely snorted before rushing at him again, now holding a kunai in each of his hands. Itachi drew a kunai of his own to defend himself, but a second before they could clash, both their eyes widened at the presence of the third participant in this spar that had suddenly appeared above them, and they barely managed to jump back before the ground between them exploded when a heel crashed into it. "Meh, Izumi, stop playing dirty like that," Shisui said. "This would have seriously hurt if it had hit, you know." The girl in question shot him an amused look. "Then all you need to do is continue to avoid getting hit, right?" Technically, Izumi was the weakest of the three of them. She was a talented jonin, of course, but compared to himself and Shisui, there was still a not too insignificant difference in strength. However, she was well aware of that herself and made up for that with strategy. Rather than fighting either of them head-on all the time, she kept to the background and let them fight each other while waiting for the optimal moment to strike. It probably also helped that she had been training with the two of them for years now. Not only had she a pretty good idea of their fighting styles, but she also improved by leaps and bounds at a frightening pace. It was fortunate that they had agreed not to use ninjutsu or genjutsu in this spar. Fighting Shisui while also avoiding doubtlessly perfectly timed techniques from Izumi would have been a pain. Itachi had no time to think about this any further, though, as it was then that the two other occupants on the training ground decided to gang up on him. He blocked Shisui's kunai with his own while slapping Izumi's hand away before it could hit his skull, resulting in her using the momentum of that to spin around and send a follow-up kick at him. Rather than trying to block that one by backing away, Itachi then pushed himself closer to Shisui to evade. The position the two of them were in, with both blocking each other's arms and standing too close to effectively throw out a kick, should have been enough to give him a short respite and allow him to plan. Unfortunately, that notion turned out to be false when Shisui didn't hesitate to swing his head at him. Although Itachi managed to tilt his own head to have his forehead protector save him from actual damage, the blow still made him stagger back and momentarily blur his vision. Izumi, not one to miss an opening, immediately came flying at him again with an axe kick. Even the brief moment of disorientation wasn't enough to allow her to escape his notice, however, so rather than letting her score a hit, Itachi threw his kunai at the likewise approaching Shisui to slow him down before catching Izumi's leg, swing her around, and throwing her at her partner. Much to his surprise, that didn't actually give the break he had expected. Izumi managed to twist in midair to fly at Shisui feet first, and the moment they hit, she pushed herself off him to throw herself back at Itachi. Furthermore, Shisui seemed to have expected that, as he had not only allowed that action but actually supported it by pushing her away with all his might as well. Consequently, Izumi was now flying at him with an extraordinary speed. Knowing that attempting to dodge would be futile, he crossed his arms in front of him to take her flying kick head-on. The impact made his arms throb and the power behind it threw him almost 20 meters back, but as the second part also allowed him to get some distance between them, he thought that was a fair trade. "So is it 2 against 1 now?" he called across the grounds, a small smile playing on his lips. "Isn't that a bit unfair? It means that we're taking you seriously enough to feel it's necessary to team up against you," Izumi called back, her expression mirroring his own. "If anything, you should feel honored. Maybe you want to be the next that is honored, then." Izumi pouted while Shisui let out a laugh before throwing his arm around her shoulders to pull her into his side. "Don't speak such nonsense, Itachi. Nothing is ever getting between the two of us, ya hear me?" As if wanting to contradict him, it was then that Izumi tried to ram her elbow into his ribs. "Hey!" Shisui exclaimed comedically as he barely dodged the strike. What are you doing? That would have hurt. Izumi put her arms on her hips as she playfully glared back at him. I should be the one asking that. What do you think you were doing, restricting my movements like this in the middle of a spar? I just wanted to demonstrate to him the power of our love. I will demonstrate the power of my fists on you if you keep that up. Itaka briefly considered using this opportunity to attack them before discarding the idea. After all, it was always amusing to watch them quarrel like this, so it would be a shame to interrupt it. Even more importantly, the likelihood of them just acting like this to lure him into a trap was quite high and he saw no reason to risk it. That theory was proven right a few seconds later when both of them turned around to look at him. It didn't work, huh? Well, it was worth a shot. What to do now, I wonder, Itaka thought as he observed the two of them. An extended 2 against 1 would be disadvantageous, so I should aim to either split them up again or end this fight altogether. The question is how, though. It would probably be best if he initiated the first attack rather than letting them do it. Getting the initiative was essential in a situation like this and it would at least allow him to somewhat control the flow of the fight, but while this sounded great in theory, implementing it in practice was much easier said than done. If he wanted to be successful, he would somehow need to catch them off guard. I wanted to tell them this after the spar, but considering the circumstance, now might just be more beneficial. An interesting strategy, he said. I'm sure most enemies who don't know you two as well as I do would actually have fallen for it. Shisui snorted. Maybe, but that hardly helps us now, does it? No, but that doesn't make it any less intriguing. Maybe you can help me come up with some strategies of my own after this. Both looked a bit confused at that, and it was Izumi who voiced what both must be thinking first. Since when do you need help coming up with strategies? He chuckled. Well, I'm afraid I don't have that much experience in dealing with genin, so having a second opinion would certainly be helpful. Genin. Why, yes. Haven't I told you? The Sandaime wants me to take a team from the students who graduate from the academy next week. He had been oddly intense about it, too, now that he thought about it. Izumi's and Shisui's eyes widened simultaneously, and just like he had hoped they would, both involuntarily let their guards down in face of his unexpected revelation. Naturally, Itaka capitalized on that immediately. He crossed the distance between them in an instant with a speed that even the Sherrinan would struggle to follow, appearing right in front of them. Shisui reacted a bit faster than Izumi, but that didn't matter as it was the latter he attacked first with a kick to her chest that she barely managed to block. However, with how hastily put together her defense was, she couldn't avoid stumbling backwards from the power behind the attack and consequently left herself open for a follow-up attack. Itaka had no intention of exploiting that opening, though. Instead, he fell into a crouch and swung his right leg parallel to the ground to sweep away the footing of the incoming Shisui who had instinctively tried to come to his girlfriend's aid. He immediately tried to follow up with an axe kick but missed by a hair when Shisui pushed himself off the ground with hands and jumped away. Unfortunately for him, that didn't help him avoid the second kick that came afterwards, resulting in him flying backwards through the training ground. Izumi had recovered by then and tried to use the opportunity to attack him from behind, but Itaka was ready for her. They exchanged blows and kicks for several seconds, blocking or dodging punches and redirecting each other limbs to miss them when that wasn't an option before he managed to catch her wrists. Not one to give up easily, however, Izumi did what Shisui did earlier and swung her head. Seeing the attack coming this time, Itaka merely tilted his head out of the way while he prepared to twist her arms in a way that would make her unable to move. He was in for a surprise, though. As it turned out, actually hitting him hadn't been her primary goal all along. While he had easily managed to avoid her head, the same couldn't be said about her hair. Getting hit by it obviously didn't hurt, but for a short moment, it not only blocked his sight but also made him instinctively flinch back just a little bit. After all, he was an Uchiha, and like all members of not only his clan but the Hyuga as well, he was sensitive when it came to his eyes. The time frame was short. Almost non-existent, in fact. However, Izumi successfully managed to use the minuscule opportunity his reaction brought her to twist out of his grip and jump back, saving herself. Less than 10 seconds after his attack, the three of them faced each other again from 3 different positions on the training ground, all of them waiting for the others to make the first move. So this strategy failed. It was Shisui who broke the silence first. Well, if nothing else, this proves that you're good enough to come up with strategies on your own. He then chuckled. Although it was kinda dirty of you to throw something like that at us. You were the ones who decided to team up, he replied amused. I'm just repaying the favor. Shisui conceded that with a shrug. After all, even if paying dirty were something bad for a shinobi, he really couldn't complain when he had done so first. But is it true? Izumi spoke up. Are you really taking a genin team? He tilted his head with a thoughtful frown. I'm not certain yet, he said. Although Hokage-sama would like me to take one, he leaves the final decision to me and I haven't decided yet. In that aspect, he was more fortunate than Kakashi. The man always complained about the teams he had to test on order of the Hokage even though he had repeatedly made it very clear that he didn't want to become a Jonin instructor. I think you should do it. He shot Shisui a surprised look while also making sure to keep an eye on Izumi in case she used this opportunity to attack him. What makes you think so? Aside from the fact that passing your knowledge and skills to the next generation can't be anything but a good thing, you mean? Shisui shrugged. Well, it would certainly be something new for you. I mean, when was the last time you needed to exert yourself? Really exert yourself, that is. No mission is ever the same as the one before, sure, and there is always something that can go wrong, but I think there's not much left for you to learn within the bounds of your duties as Jonin. Broadening your horizon and trying something new would surely be good for you. That was, well, much more of an answer than he had expected. However, he couldn't say Shisui was wrong, exactly. As he had said, Itaki had reached the limit of what being a Jonin had to offer. In all honesty, he couldn't even say that this position had helped him a lot to begin with in terms of personal growth. It had allowed him to connect with more comrades than he had during the former timeline, allowed him to proudly carry out his duties and protect his home while also spilling much less blood of innocence than he had during his time in the Umbu, but other than that. Itaka probably could join the Umbu once more, of course, but he didn't like the thought of that. He would do it if ordered to by the Hokage, but with everything he associated with that rank, he had no desire to join that unit out of his own volition. Teaching a team of genin, on the other hand, would be an entirely new experience. It was also regularly said that teaching others did a lot in helping one to understand themselves better as well, so there was that. Besides, I do enjoy teaching. I think Shisui is right. Oh, wow, the boy in question said in response to Izumi's words, a teasing grin on his face. That's a new one. Rather than replying to that, she continued as if he hadn't spoken at all. I have seen you train others before, you know, and you did a great job with them. Haku is already miles ahead of the rest of her team thanks to you and probably could have become Chunin years ago if they didn't hold her back, and I don't envy the poor sod who's going to be saddled with your brother or Naruto. You clearly not only enjoy teaching but are also really good at it, so I don't see why you shouldn't take this opportunity to try something new. Itaka looked at both of them for several seconds before letting out a soft sigh that was both amused and resigned in equal measure. I see the two of you think quite strongly about it. Shisui chuckled. Well, someone has to tell you these kinds of things if you are so indecisive about something that should be clear from the beginning, right? Seems like it, yes. They both had good points, and in truth, Itaki had thought along the same lines before. It wasn't as if he couldn't see the advantages, after all. However, for some reason, he had still been hesitant. Had still been unsure whether it was truly the right thing to do. Having someone bluntly tell him that, yes, it actually is a good idea, was exactly what he had needed. All right then, he finally said. I will accept the Sandame's offer. A Jonin instructor, huh? That's unexpected, but it would certainly be a valuable new experience. Itaka nodded at his father's words before swallowing the food in his mouth. That's what I was thinking as well. Shisui and Izumi were rather persistent, too. I always regretted not having the chance of becoming an instructor myself, his mother added from the other side of the table with a thoughtful frown on her face. I never requested a team from the Hokage because there always seemed to be more than enough time left to do it later, and then suddenly you came along and the opportunity was gone. She then threw a sly look at his father. A certain someone is the exact opposite, though. What was it that you always said, dear? Being settled with a group of brats would be worse than dealing with a group of Hyaga during a day off, right? His father didn't dignify that with a reply, choosing instead to put another piece of meat into his mouth. They were currently sitting at the dining table in the kitchen. Sasuke would usually be there as well, but as he was eating out at the Naraz today after having somehow convinced his friend Shikamaru to hold a study session for their entire group of friends in preparation for their graduation exams next week at his place, it was only the three of them today. That was also the reason he chose to tell his parents about his choice now. After all, if Sasuke knew that there was even the slightest chance that he could become his sensei, he would surely hope for it to happen. As a result, the disappointment he would feel if it didn't become true would be all the worse. Sasuke's graduation was all but guaranteed, of course. As Izumi had pointed out earlier, his brother was more than capable to pass all his exams with flying colors, and Itachi had no doubt that he would also be able to pass whatever test his future sensei would come up with. The only one that might pose some difficulty was Kakashi, but considering Sasuke and his team had passed that one as well in the other timeline, even that shouldn't be too much of a problem. However, there was no way to know for sure if he would be put into Itaka's team. Thus, it was better to wait with this news and just surprise him on the day of his graduation. Regardless of whether Sasuke would ultimately be on his team or not, this way was doubtlessly the best one. Well, his mother said, pulling him back into the present. I also have an announcement to make, and this time is just as good as any other, I think. She focused mostly on Itaka when she continued. Now that Sasuke is graduating, he will also go on missions soon enough. With you being away much of the time due to your own duties and your father being usually gone for most of the day as well, I have decided that there's really no reason for me anymore to be at home all the time. Thus, I have petitioned the Hokage to reinstate me into active duty. Itaka blinked. That wasn't something he had expected at all. The reintegration process will naturally take a while, she continued. While I tried to keep in shape over the years, I will still need to train for a while until I'm back in top form. That obviously means I won't take any all too dangerous missions for quite some time yet. Furthermore, I will also avoid taking any missions that take me away from the village for too long anytime soon. Sasuke won't go on any long-term missions for a while yet either, after all, and I think someone should be here whenever he comes home until he's a bit older. That was actually quite a lot to take in. Much to his embarrassment, he hadn't really thought about how Sasuke's graduation would affect his mother. He had never known a life in which she wasn't a constant presence at home, a source of strength that was always available and easy to find by simply walking through the front door. He always knew that she was a kunoichi at heart, but the idea that she could go back into active duty had just never occurred to him. I really should have known better. I'm happy for you, he said with a sincere smile. If you need someone to train with, I would be happy to help you. That sentiment was completely honest. It would be a lie to say that he was happy that his mother would inevitably put herself in danger, but now that he actually bothered to think about it, he could clearly see how much this meant to her. Being a kunoichi was who she was, what she had been bred and born to be, and she found fulfillment in that profession. If anything, the fact that she had become a housewife for all these years without ever showing any discomfort or regret about that decision when it was the exact opposite of what she wanted to do showed just how much she loved both him and Sasuke. I might take you up on that, she chuckled, and Itachi easily recognized the gratitude in her eyes at his easy acceptance of her decision. However, you're better focus on your team first. I can find someone else to spare with easily enough while they will primarily depend on you. They will first need to pass my test, though. As long as you give them a fair chance, I'm sure they will do just fine. He conceded that with a simple nod before glancing at his father who had silently continued to eat during their conversation. From his lack of reaction, Itaka could conclude that he had already known about his mother's decision. Not surprising, of course. However, the odd thing was that he almost seemed displeased by it. Now, his father could be many things, but Itaka was quite certain that he wasn't one of these men that disliked their wives being anything more than a housewife. He had heard him complain about such notions in the past, in fact. So what about this could it be that he was unhappy about? His mother appeared to have caught his glance and guessed what he was thinking, for she explained just that. Ah, you see, Your father wanted me to join the police force rather than the regular shinobi roster. He wasn't too happy about me rejecting that offer. Ah, he thought. That would explain it. From what he had heard from others, a recurring problem in romantic relationships between shinobi was that both parties knew exactly how dangerous their profession was. Most shinobi didn't grow old because they died violent and bloody deaths long before their time, usually far away from home. It also wasn't unusual for their bodies to be never recovered. For all that civilians technically knew how dangerous the life of a shinobi was, it was only fellow shinobi who truly understood the scope of the terrors they faced on a regular basis. While Itachi had never experienced it himself in regards to a romantic partner, he certainly felt that way about his friends and soon enough Sasuke as well going on missions. His father was one of the most distinguished shinobi in the village, a veteran of countless battles who survived the terror that was the last war. Of course he didn't like the notion of his wife going on missions any more than Itachi did, but other than his father was actually in a position from where he could offer a safer alternative. Being displeased that she turned that alternative down was only to be expected. She is right, his father said. I would have preferred her to join the police force. She would certainly have been an asset and rise through the ranks quickly. However, Yes, his mother interrupted him, and while she kept the warm smile on her face, her voice was noticeably less accommodating. And I would need to listen to all the comments about it happening just because you're my husband while I do that. Also, it's no secret that working for your spouse is one of the worst things you can do in a relationship. However, his father continued as if she hadn't said anything. I still support her decision. It was only then that he turned directly towards her. I know just how capable you are, but you can't fault me for worrying. Surely you wouldn't have been happy if I suddenly decided to quit my current position to rejoin the regular roster. His mother kept her expression guarded for a few more seconds before visibly relaxing. Yes, you're right. She shot him a warm smile. I'm glad you aren't fighting me on that. Of course not. I dislike our fights just as much as you do. While Itachi was grateful for the reminder that his parents' marriage was one of love rather than an arranged one, the affectionate look his father gave his mother was honestly rather off-putting. While he was certainly much more open with his emotions in this timeline, his father would never be a particularly outgoing person, so the sight was a truly strange one. Consequently, before this could continue any further, he deliberately bumped his chopsticks against the porcelain bowl in front of him when he picked another piece of flesh, making a chattering sound to remind them that he was still here. The faint but impossible to miss brush of red on their cheeks when they turned back towards him was in equal measures cute as it was disturbing. To her credit, when his mother spoke up again, her voice didn't sound any different than before. Anyway, please don't tell Sasuke about this yet. Let him focus on his exams for now. I will tell it to him myself once he has passed all of them. Of course, Kaa-san. It made sense, of course. Now was just about the worst time to distract him. Still, he thought with a hint of amusement. Having not only one but two surprises thrown at him like this will surely result in an interesting reaction. He would need to make sure to be there when his mother told him about her decision. That wasn't something he wanted to miss, after all. Chapter 47, Graduation 2. Let's start this from the beginning. Graduation 2. Don't forget your bag again, you hear me? If your sensei tells me one more time that you sit in class without your books, I will dash. Kiba groaned while Akamaru hit his head beneath his paws at his feet. I got it, Kaa-san. Then what are you still doing here? Class starts in less than 10 minutes. If I hear you're late again, you will be responsible for cleaning the kennels for the rest of the month. Damn, what's with all the threats today? Did she wake up on the wrong side of the bed or what? From the outside, it would appear like his mother was almost always in a foul mood, but those that were close to her knew that it was generally nothing serious. Sure, she had a potty mouth, liked to brag, and screamed more often than not, but all that was ultimately more playful than anything else. It also made the times she was deliberately gentle stand out all the more, too. Today, on the other hand, she seemed seriously annoyed. Just ignore her, an amused voice spoke up from behind him. It's me she's angry with, not you. She will probably have forgotten she said anything to you by the time you come home. His lips curved into a shit-eating grin as he turned around to look at his sister. Oh? And what did you do to piss her off like that? Hana leaned against the wall next to the door, her arms crossed in front of her and a wistful smile on her face. I got an offer to join the Umbu, she said with a casual shrug. And I accepted. Kaa-san is mad about that. That didn't make any sense to him. Most Inyazuka joined the Umbu at some point or another, after all. Their abilities were just too useful for the Hunter Nin Corps to ignore. Shouldn't that make her happy, then? I mean, she's always speaking about how much she misses being in the Umbu and how being a Jonin doesn't compare. His sister sighed before shrugging once more. Well, apparently joining the Umbu is only great as long as you don't do so as medic nin. That made him freeze. Wait, you were actually serious about becoming a medic? Evidently, yes. But you know just how much Kaa-san hates them. Kiba's eyes unwillingly wandered to the small shrine that stood at the other end of the room and more specifically the frame that held a picture of a grinning man in his early 30s on it before turning back towards Hana with a glare. Didn't she say she would kick you out of the house if you actually went through with it and became a medic? When did you even find the time to take the necessary classes? Akamaru, clearly feeling how agitated he was, wobbled his head in agreement before letting out a loud bark. Neither his glare nor the bark impressed Hana very much, however. If anything, it seemed to amuse her. Don't worry about that, kiddo, she chuckled before pushing herself off the wall. Kaa-san loves making threats, but she won't kick me out. Rage a bit and maybe even whine like a newborn pup, sure, but she will calm down in a day or two. Then she suddenly took a quick step forward and managed to ruffle his hair before he swept her hand away with an angry growl. That was exactly why he always wore his hood, damn it. Stop that, he growled while taking a cautious step back. How could I when you're always so adorable when you're embarrassed? I'm not adorable. The grin on her face was exactly the same as the one he had sported a bit earlier. Oh, you totally are. Kiba huffed before looking away. She can be just as annoying as Kaa-san sometimes. Hana was generally much more laid back and even-tempered than the rest of their clan, but that unfortunately also meant she could be much more subtle in her approach. Where he or his mother would scream at each other when they were annoyed about one thing or another or even took the problem to the training grounds, Hana would more often than not just walk away and wait until the other party forgot that they even had a fight to begin with before taking her revenge. Needless to say, Kiba generally tried to avoid pissing her off. Anyway, Hana continued. Kaa-san was right about the academy starting soon, so you'd better run. Her grin impossibly grew even bigger. Forget 10 minutes. You might have half that if you're lucky. His eyes widened. Damn it, he cursed before rushing out of the door without another glance back. Kmin, Akamaru. He didn't even have time to be angry with his sister for delaying him. Iruka-sensei will kill me if I'm late again. Kiba had been in enough trouble lately thanks to Naruto's shenanigans which he somehow always ended joining in on, so getting in even more trouble was the absolutely last thing he wanted. Not that this would stop him from participating in whatever Naruto comes up with next, mind you. The results were usually funny enough to compensate for the telling off that always followed. However, even as he ran through the narrow side alleys of the village in an attempt to take as many shortcuts as possible, Kiba couldn't stop thinking about the conversation with his sister. He knew that she had been interested in medical ninjutsu for a while now and had even heard her speak about becoming a medic in the past, but after the big fight she had with their mother a while back, he had been sure she would stop pursuing that goal. Who would have actually thought that she would secretly take classes for 3 years, the minimum requirement to be a medic in the Umbu, to become a full-fledged medic nin? Furthermore, while Kiba didn't hate medics himself, he found it hard to understand what Hana found so interesting about them. Healing was boring. Part of the reason it was his worst subject in the academy was that he couldn't focus on the material no matter how hard he tried, so he found it really weird that she would go through that willingly. It was almost as unbelievingly as her doing something that went so directly against everything their mother wanted. He shuddered at the thought of how her reaction must have been when Hana first told her about her decision. Maybe I should join that study session at Shikamaru's that Sasuke was talking about, he thought. As boring as that sounds, it's surely better than risking being pulled into another one of their fights. Then, remembering the grade of his last test, he grimaced. And I guess some studying might actually be useful, too. The graduation exams would be next week, after all, and Kiba had no intentions of failing them. The sound that the impact of his blows made on the block of wood was easily drowned out by the shrieks and screams of the other students in the background, but Shino didn't care about that. As long as he could hear the dull thuds when his kicks and punches landed on the trunk in front of him, as long as he could hear and feel the results of his efforts, he was satisfied. Or, at least that's what he tried to tell himself. Now if he could only believe it too, things would be fine, but that was unfortunately not the case. No, the truth was that he was anything but pleased with his performance so far. Shino knew that he was acting ridiculous, that he shouldn't be unhappy with his taijutsu skills when he was already in the top 5 of his class, but he couldn't help it. No matter how much effort he put into it or how precise and fluid his moves were, he could never be completely satisfied with them. There was always something lacking even if he couldn't say what exactly it was. Iruka-sensei had been clueless when he approached the man with that matter, merely waving him off while telling him that he was plenty good already as he is and that he was just imagining things, and even his father hadn't been much of a help. Although considering his father hated taijutsu with a passion and tried to avoid it at any costs if possible, that probably wasn't much of a surprise. However, no matter what the people around him tried to tell him, Shino knew that he was lacking in skill. In the top 5 of his class he might be, yes, but compared to those ranked above him, he was nothing. What was it worth to be the 5th best if he couldn't even put off a fight against number 4? Kiba beat him in less than a minute flat without even breaking a sweat, and he did so times and times again regardless of which strategy Shino tried in their spars. It was so very frustrating, even if he would never openly admit or even just show it. Yes, things might be different if he were allowed to use his Kikaicho, but that wasn't the point. Besides, Kiba would be allowed to use his clan's techniques as well in such a fight, so there was no way of saying for sure whether he would really win or not. And even if he did win, Kiba was only the 4th strongest, so there were still 3 others even better than that. It also didn't help that Shino wasn't even the best in pure academics either. For someone like him who valued his intelligence quite highly and liked to think of himself as a rather clever individual, needing to constantly compete for a top position irked him. Amusingly enough, he had actually liked the competition at first, had liked the challenge they provided, but as the times when his grades were the best of the class became rarer and rarer, that quickly turned sour as well. He could accept being worse than Sasuke. The other boy was admittedly a genius who also had an even greater genius as brother who could help him with his schoolwork, so that was fine. What was not fine, on the other hand, was that Sakura regularly outscored him as well while apparently not even putting very much effort into it. That was just insulting. Even if she took things more serious ever since Tsunade held a presentation for their class and especially since she joined the group of students that took voluntary lessons at the hospital, Shino had always been serious. It was he who worked hard both in class and in his free time, he who tried to absorb every drop of knowledge taught to them, and he who made becoming better his top priority. It wasn't fair that she would outscore him. And worst of all, he knew that if Shikamaru wanted to, he could easily beat everyone in their class including Shino with laughable ease. Shino was perfectly aware that he had high expectations of himself, probably even too high ones, and that not being the best wasn't a bad or even unusual thing, but he couldn't stop it. He wanted to be good. He wanted to be acknowledged for his skills. Everyone wanted that to some degree, of course, but it always seemed to him that he was the only one who truly strived for it. Well, that's not quite true, he thought. Naruto and Sasuke are just as motivated, aren't they? He knew the other two long and well enough to realize that they were working just as hard for their respective dreams. However, that was exactly what made them different. Naruto wanted to become better merely to be the best while Sasuke primarily wanted to become better than his brother. Shino, on the other hand, wanted to prove both to himself and to the rest of the world that he could become better. That he was just as talented as his friends, and that an Aburame could be just as exceptional as an Uchiha or a Hyuga or any other famous clan. He ignored the small voice in the back of his head which told him that his goal wasn't all that different from theirs at all. I just need to train more, Shino told himself as he executed another roundhouse kick to the stump in front of him. My moves will become more fluid the more I train them, I will be able to use them more effectively the more used to them I become, and they will gain more impact the stronger I grow. Consequently, I will only improve the harder I train. He ignored the small voice in the back of his head once more when it tried to tell him that this wouldn't give him much of an advantage, as the same was true for everyone else as well. It didn't matter. He would graduate from the academy soon and become a genin, which then would give him access to a jonin instructor. Everyone had different strengths and weaknesses, and everyone improved at different rates and through different methods. Shino was sure that direct training under a jonin would be much more beneficial to him than the class-orientated studying he was doing right now. Furthermore, the real-life experiences from going on missions should surely be helpful as well. All he needed to do was keep a calm mind and take in what his sensei would teach him like a sponge. Analyze the information, assimilate it, and then improve upon it. He could do that. Shino was sure of it. And then he would show the world that the Abarame were more than just creepy bug people. Hinata watched enviously as about a third of her classmates, led by Sakura and Ino, stormed out of the room as soon as the bell rang. While they rushed to the hospital for extra lessons, she had no other choice but to go home and undergo whatever training her father had scheduled for the day. It wasn't their fault that she wasn't allowed to join them, but a small part of her that Hinata could never quite push away felt angry with them. Listening to them talk about what they would learn next or whether they would be allowed to actually help out with patients when she had no chance of ever joining them was simply too frustrating to ignore. Again, she knew it wasn't their fault, but it was easier to be cross with them than to be the same with her father. They couldn't punish her for disobedience, after all. I should just be happy that the academy has included mandatory healing classes in its curriculum, she thought with a small sigh as she packed her things while ignoring the fight between Naruto and Kiba a few rows below her. That's better than nothing, I guess. Hinata had been ecstatic when they were first told about that change a few years ago, and even more so when it was said that there were also some extracurricular classes they could take at the hospital. Apparently, Tsunade of the Sun in herself would show up from time to time to give them some pointers. She had always been interested in healing, so she had naturally looked forward to these classes. After all, how often did one ever get the opportunity to learn from the greatest medic of all time? However, her father quickly put a stop to her excitement by forbidding her to sign up for these classes. In his words, none of his daughters would degrade themselves by becoming a lowly medic. Such a thing was apparently beneath a Hyuga heiress. Most members of her clan were destined to join the Anbu. The Byakugan was an extremely useful tool for the kinds of missions they were doing, whether it was for mere patrols through Konoha's forests, guard duties in the village itself, or infiltration missions in foreign nations. Her clan's dojutsu was always a valuable asset to have. And although the members of the Anbu did not necessarily require outstanding combat skills to perform their duties, it was not a disadvantage either, meaning anyone who was proficient in the Gentle Fist would be a valuable member of any team they were part of even if they didn't possess their famous eyes. In the same vein, their clan's excellent chakra control often resulted in them also becoming their team's medic. It only made sense, of course. Most medical ninjutsu weren't too hard to learn when one possessed the Byakugan, and combined with their chakra control, it would be a waste not to let a Hyuga become a medic. As long as one wasn't the heiress of the clan, that is. Even the very few non-combative members were taught some basic medical ninjutsu, allowing them to pull their weight without actively risking their lives, but she was strictly forbidden from doing the same. In fact, her father had tried to talk with her teachers to get her out of these classes and even went almost to the Hokage when he was turned away. Where her clan members were encouraged to widen their horizon and add new abilities to their skill set in addition to their clan's techniques which they were still expected to master, of course in an effort to improve themselves, Hinata was expected to focus solely on the Gentle Fist. The logic behind it was that she would be the face of the clan one day and as such needed to represent their family's famed technique to the rest of the world. Thus, her own wishes were ignored in favor of what was expected of her. Hinata once believed that her father would allow her to study healing if she just improved her taijutsu enough, that taking other interests would be permitted as long as she excelled in her duties, but that dream had long since come to an end. It's not fair, she thought while clenching her fists in an effort to banish her frustration, knowing full well that it would be better to do so now while she still walked through the streets than to show insolence back at home. Healing is useful. Everyone says so. There really should be no harm in learning it, right? She might not be as much of a prodigy as her sister, but all her training had definitively paid off. Her father hadn't even called her a disappointment in over a year now. If all her hard work so far hadn't been enough to convince him, nothing ever would. It's unfair, she thought once more. Why can't I? And why are you running around with such a grim expression, I wonder? Hinata jumped around, eyes widening in surprise while her problems were momentarily forgotten. Aji-san. Her uncle stood next to the entrance of their clan's compound with his hand hidden in his sleeves and a small, amused smile on his lips. Don't tell me you were so out of it that you didn't even notice me standing here. She couldn't help but blush at that. While she certainly could be oblivious at times, she at least tried to always be aware of her surroundings as befitting of a Hyuga. If it had been her father who saw her like this rather than her uncle, well. Hinata made to bow and apologize, but he clearly predicted what she was about to do and stopped her before she could do much more than straighten up and open her mouth. None of that, dear, he told her gently as he put a hand on her shoulder. Everyone is allowed to daydream from time to time. Just be sure to not let it happen again, all right? But Hinata began only to stop herself when she saw his raised eyebrow. Okay, she said instead, a small smile that mirrored his own forming on her lips. I will make sure that it won't happen again. I know you will. It was embarrassing, but sometimes Hinata pretended that Hisashi was her father instead of her uncle. After all, he acted much more like family than her real father ever did. He took the time to talk with her about things she was interested in, helped her with her schoolwork when she was struggling, and even regularly invited her to dine with him and Niji. While her father was clan head first and family second, Hisashi seemed to truly care about her. He also looked exactly like her father, being his twin and all, which made it very easy to imagine how things could have been if she were born to him instead. Hinata remembered that they weren't very close when she was younger and would even go so far as to say that he had been outright cold towards her, but then, one day, he just suddenly changed. She had no idea why that was or what had caused this change, but she was thankful for it nonetheless. In all honesty, she didn't know what she would have done without him in her life. However, now wasn't the time to think about such things. Were you waiting for me, Aji-san? That was the only reason she could think of for why he just stand at the outer gate like this, at least. I was, he confirmed her suspicion. I know you and Niji planned to train today, but unfortunately, his sensei came by and picked him up for a mission. He then let out a little laugh. He implied it to be an important one, but it's impossible to say for sure with that man, so it might as well just be another harmless escort mission. Regardless, I'm afraid Niji can't help you today. Even as she smiled along, Hinata could suppress the pang of disappointment in her chest. She obviously understood that Niji had no say in that matter and thus wasn't mad at him, but she had really looked forward to training with him. And I wanted to train my protecting 8 trigrams 64 palms technique, too. Thank you for telling me, she said and even managed to give him a small bow of gratitude before he could stop her. He always told her not to bow to him, that it would be unsightly for the heiress to bow to a mere branch member, but she didn't care. But you really didn't have to wait for me to tell me that. I would have visited you anyway if Niji hadn't come at the agreed time. Oh? You think I waited here just to play Masager? She blinked in surprise at his teasing tone. You didn't. Of course not. He seemed genuinely amused now. You recently increased your training because you graduate from the academy next week, didn't you? It would hardly be proper of me if I just leave you to it. It has been a while since we trained together, so why don't you let me see if I can help you now that Niji is busy? Her mood immediately brightened. Really? I would never be so cruel as to lie about such a thing. Hinata forcefully suppressed the urge to grin like an idiot and gave him another bow while ignoring his protests. Training with her uncle wasn't quite the same as with Niji, of course, but it was still something she looked forward to. After all, while her father somewhat surprisingly didn't have a problem with her spending time with him and Niji, he usually insisted that training regularly with a branch member was beneath her. Why that rule didn't seem to apply to her training with Niji, she didn't know, and as she was afraid that asking would result in her being forbidden from training with him as well, she had no way of finding out either. However, none of that mattered right now. As her uncle had said, the two of them hadn't trained together in a while, so it should be fine if they did so today. He wouldn't have asked her if it weren't. Hinata didn't even notice the spring in her step as she followed him to the dojo. Maybe today is not so terrible after all. It seems I got lucky, Itaka thought as he walked through the empty corridors of the academy, his eyes focused on the files in his hand. All three of them should at the very least have the basics already down. It would be a lie to claim that he wasn't a bit disappointed that he didn't get Sasuke on his team, but he had been expecting that. After all, while it wasn't an actual rule per se, it was rare for family members to be put together to avoid things like favoritism. Not that it was possible to avoid entirely, of course, but there was no harm in at least encouraging objectivity and neutralism. It's still a shame, though. Anyway, there was nothing he could do about it now, so he brought his attention back to the papers in his hands. It would have been beneficial to know who his students would be ahead of time, but the Hokage has seen it fit to keep it to himself until the very last moment. From what he had heard, he did the same with the other teams as well. Itaka was not quite sure why he did it even though he had a few ideas, but regardless of what the reason was, it made his job a lot more inconvenient. He would have liked to prepare his test according to his prospective students' characters and abilities, after all. Such a task was obviously difficult if you didn't even know their identity until mere minutes before the fact. It was truly fortunate that he had eventually just come up with a rather simple test that could easily be adjusted for whatever purpose he required. In a way, having 3 clan heirs on his team was a boon as well. While they were probably better trained and consequently better prepared for whatever he would throw at them than most of their peers, he was already somewhat familiar with their skills through working with clan members of theirs in the past, making it easier for him to plan ahead. Itaka took a moment to collect himself and put the files away as he stood before the door that led into the classroom. Even the closed door couldn't keep the noises away, however, reminding him once again why he had nothing but the utmost respect for academy instructors. It was understandable that the freshly graduated genin would be excited and psyched up, but if this was the noise that came out from a room that contained the most mature age group, he dreaded to think about the younger years. He never truly appreciated his luck for having his own stay here cut short, did he? Putting these thoughts aside, Itaka took one more deep breath before opening the door and stepping in. He glanced around the room and found his future charges immediately. The third row from the front, he thought. Dark pants, a gray, hooded fur-lined coat, messy brown hair, and red markings on his cheeks. Kiba Inyazuka. Apparently short-tempered and impulsive as well as easy to rile up. Determined, too, and self-confident about his abilities. Itaka's gaze fell to the floor at the boy's feet. And, of course, his Ninken Akamaru. His eyes wandered a bit to the left. Second row from the back. Dark sunglasses and a sea green jacket with a high, upturned collar. Shino Abarame. Outwardly always calm and collected, but his teachers noted that he tends to overthink things and holds himself to impossibly high standards. And last but not least. Very last row in the back. White, sleeveless dress with lavender trimmings as well as dark pants and shoulder-length hair. Hinata Hyuga. Generally rather withdrawn and reserved. Doesn't like much attention but still manages to concentrate on her spars even under the stars of her classmates. All in all, not a bad team at all. If they managed to successfully pass his test, Itaka was sure he could mold them into something great. There was something else he needed to deal with first, though. Nii-san. Sasuke was looking at him with wide eyes as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing, and if they were alone, Itaka would have loved nothing more than to tease him about it. He had grown a bit more distant over the last few years. Not as much as Itaka had feared, but still. It was apparently uncool and childish to be too close to your older brother, so Sasuke generally didn't try to spend time with him all the time anymore. It could be worse, he knew. While he didn't come running in hopes of spending time with him with a hopeful glimmer in his eyes anymore, he did ask him to train regularly. That was then usually and totally coincidentally, of course followed by eating out for dinner or just roaming the streets and casually talking with each other, and they were sometimes even joined by one of Sasuke's friends. Still, Itaka missed the times when Sasuke was younger. He was much more adorable back then. Not that he had any right to complain. That he actually could see him grow up at all was already an immense improvement from the last timeline, after all. Whoa! Naruto exclaimed from next to Sasuke as he pointed a finger at him. What are you doing here? Itaka could feel the eyes from all over the now mostly silent class, especially those that belonged to the students that already realized what his presence here meant on him, as he replied with an amused smile. Well, I was told that I would find my students here. The anticipation in the air suddenly skyrocketed. Unless I'm wrong. No. He had directed the question vaguely towards the entire room, but he didn't quite expect that half of them would exclaim like this. It was entertaining to observe, though, so he didn't mind. Sasuke's was the best of them all, of course. His eyes had impossibly widened even further, and it was clear what he was hoping. I shouldn't tease him any more than this, he thought. Better to clear things up while he's still getting his hopes up than crush them when he's already full of expectations. Teammate, he said while looking at the three teens in question one after another. We meet at training ground 10 in 15 minutes. Please note that tardiness will result in punishment. Itaka waited a few moments, just long enough to see the reaction of his aspiring students, before making a one-handed seal and vanishing in a puff of smoke. Overly dramatic? Probably. But this was one of these situations where making an impression was more important than functionality, so it was alright. Now all he had to do was to wait for them to arrive. Well then, let's see how they do, shall we? Chapter 48, Graduation 3. Let's start this from the beginning. Graduation 3. 15 minutes later, Itaka found himself in the middle of a small clearing with his three students panting at his feet. Although considering it was just a small patch of grass without trees less than 10 meters in diameter, calling it a clearing was probably a bit of an exaggeration. Much more important than that, however, was that the three of them had managed to get here as fast as they did. An average freshly graduated genin would probably need about 20 to 25 minutes from the academy to this training ground, maybe a minute or two less if they tried really hard, but all three had managed it in less than that. Better than expected, wasn't quite good enough in this case, though. 11 minutes and 26 seconds, 14 minutes and 52 seconds, and 16 minutes and 12 seconds, he listed their times before giving all of them an approving nod. I admit that all three of you exceeded my expectation by several minutes. Well done. The only one who had any energy to spare was Kiba, having not only been the first one to arrive and consequently the one with the most time to rest, but also being the one with the best physical condition in the first place, so while he was still breathing hard, it was only he who looked up with a smug grin. He ignored the Inuzuka and instead looked at the other boy of the group. Unfortunately, one of you didn't make it within the 15 minutes limit I gave you. Shino was by far the most exhausted from the group, but even his wheezing didn't hide the fact that he was angry with himself. He doubted the other two noticed it, as the boy's self-control was rather advanced for his age and even further aided by the concealing clothes he wore, but Itaka could easily see the tension in his shoulders and how hard he tried not to frown. Sensei. Unexpectedly, it was the Hyuga who spoke up next, and while she seemed anxious, she determinedly maintained direct eye contact with him as she spoke. I know you said that tardiness would be punished, but it was only 1 minute, so. Nervous she might be, but she doesn't let that stop her from standing up for her teammate, Itaka thought, pleased. So her teacher's files were actually correct when they stated that she doesn't act in a typical Hyuga fashion, then. You needn't worry about him, he told her, noticing not only the relief on her face but also the little upward press of Kiba's lips that the boy was trying to hide. So he was worried for him as well, huh? Very good. Now, let's see if these two can keep that attitude up even after the next revelation. Rather, you should prepare for dealing with the punishment yourself. The instantaneous shift from relief to shock and then disbelief on both their faces was admittedly quite amusing to watch. But Sensei dash. You can't dash. Itaka raised one hand to silence them and was surprised that it actually worked. He had thought that at least the Inuzuka wouldn't care to control himself. Much to his surprise, however, the one person he didn't expect to speak up at all opened his mouth before he could even open his mouth. Sensei, Shino said, his breath still labored. I apologize for not being here on time, but please don't punish the entire team for my shortcomings but me only. One of the most common problems for Jonin instructors in the beginning was to promote cooperation and teamwork among their students. Itake knew that the academy had begun incorporating these traits more into its curriculum over the last few years, but he hadn't expected it to be quite this successful. It would certainly become beneficial in the future, though. If they manage to pass my test, that is. A commendable sentiment, he praised the boy. Commendable, but ultimately futile. I'm afraid I maintain that all three of you will be punished equally. Shino immediately opened his mouth to protest further, but Kiba beat him to it, his growl sounding no different to the one his canine companion to his feet let out. But that's unfair. He raised a single eyebrow as he looked down on the boy. Is it? Of course it is. Why? Kiba looked at him as if he was crazy. What is there not to understand? How is it fair that all of us get punished when it is just Shino who wasn't here in time? Exerting pressure and playing people against each other was one of the easiest ways to see how much of a team player someone was, and that was exactly what Itake was currently doing. After all, while it was nice to know that the three of them general could work in a team, he needed to know how much it would take for them to turn their back on each other. Hinata, at least, seemed only unhappy with his statement but didn't complain about it. Kiba, on the other hand. Itake knew that Kiba and Shino were both part of Sasuke's group of friends and thus should at least be well acquainted with each other even if they weren't close. Part of his reaction was probably just a result of the shock of the situation and incredulity at being punished when he hadn't done anything wrong, but Itake needed to be sure. Well, I will find out soon enough, I guess. Before either Kiba or Shino could complain any further, Itake released some of his chakra to stop them in their tracks while making sure not to include any killing intent. There was no need to terrify them, after all. I will offer you this first lesson for free, he said. Consider it my reward for your successful passing of the Genin exams, if you will. Depending on how today goes, this might very well be the most important piece of advice you will ever receive in your career as a shinobi. Itake waited a moment to make sure that he had their undivided attention before he continued. When you are on a team with someone, you function as a unit. Your successes and failures are also the successes and failures of your teammates. If you don't help each other, you will suffer the consequences just as much as they do. Right now, that only means sharing the same punishment, but in the worst case, it can be what makes the difference between life and death. There was a reason Konoha relied on teamwork as much as it did. The sentiment of putting one's team even before the mission didn't always work out. The case of Sakumo Hatake was a good example of that, and there were arguably cases where that made sense and sacrifices needed to be made, but on the whole, it was teamwork that made their village so strong. Judging by the wide-eyed expressions on the teens' faces, they at least grasped the basics of that reality from his little speech. Well then, he asked after a few seconds of tense silence. Are there any more complaints? Predictably, there were none. In that case, it's 100 push UPS for each of you. Technically, that wouldn't be too hard of a task for any of them. However, still exhausted as they were from their previous run, it would be sufficient in tiring them out even more. Not truly exhausting them, of course, but still depleting their stamina all the same. They took a little over 5 minutes to finish, but ultimately, all of them successfully did the exercise without as much as a single complaint. They do have some promise, I will give them that. Well done, he praised them before kneeling down and spreading out a scroll on the ground from which he summoned 3 bottles of water. You may rest for now. All we do next is talk, so use the time to regain your breath. The 3 had stood up after finishing their exercise, but at his words, they let themselves fall to the ground with exhausted groans, although some took care to do so in a more graceful manner than others. All of them also gratefully grabbed for one of the water bottles with similar eagerness, but it was then that something interesting happened as Hinata hesitated when she was just about to bring the bottle to her lips. Shino noticed as well. Is something wrong, Hyuga-san? The girl twitched just so slightly at suddenly being addressed like that, but when she spoke, she only sounded thoughtful. I was just wondering. Sensei, you punished all 3 of us because you wanted to see how we react, right? As some kind of test. Itake nodded, a small smile on his face. Very observant of you, he said before once more addressing all 3 together. Yes, it's exactly as she said. The entire sequence so far had been a test. Kiba seemed somewhat miffed by that, but Shino was now just as thoughtful as Hinata. This training ground isn't exactly close to the academy. Definitively not something one would expect freshly graduated genin to be able to cross in just 15 minutes. Although his glasses hid Shino's eyes, Itaka could feel the suspicious look he sent him. You didn't intend for us to be here on time, did you? Itaka's smile grew a bit wider. As I mentioned when you first arrived, all of you exceeded my expectations by several minutes, and now you exceeded them once more by actually looking right through my ploy. Well, at least the first part of it, but that's already more than he had expected this early. I'm truly impressed. Hinata and Shino glowed at the praise, well, the former more so than the latter, while Kiba shot him a suspicious glare that lost most of its effect by the dog lying on his head. So if everything so far was a test, did we finish or will there be more? There will indeed be more, Itaka admitted easily, seeing no reason to lie. However, for now, we will continue with a simple self-presentation. After all, while you might be familiar with each other already, I have only the little I heard from Sasuke and what I read in your files to go by. While all of them looked a bit apprehensive at the idea of even more tests, they took the news rather well. Seeing that, Itaka decided to take the lead. As the one who proposed it in the first place, I shall go first. As you might already know, my name is Itaka Uchiha, and while I have been a Jonin for almost 6 years now, you're the first team assigned to me. I like to spend my free time either reading about history and philosophy or training, and I dislike unnecessary violence. I don't have a specific dream for the future, aside from stopping Madara and making sure Sasuke was alright, of course, but I want to become as strong as I possibly can to protect the village and its people. There was an awkward silence for several seconds, during which everyone waited for someone else to speak up next before Kiba apparently decided that it would be much better to continue himself rather than let the uncomfortable situation continue. Alright then, I guess I will go next, My name is Kiba Inyazuka and I'm 12 years old. I like training with Akamaru. He raised his hand to pat his dog's head, who in turn gave a loud bark in return, and meeting my friends. What I hate is cleaning the kennels back at home. Oh, and my dream is to one day beat my mother in a fair fight and get a picture of her face when she realizes that she lost. Itaka actually chuckled a bit at that. A lofty goal indeed if what Hana said is true. Then, before Kiba could ask him how exactly he knew his sister, he turned to the girl next to him with an expectant expression. My name is Hinata Hyuga, she said as she straightened just so slightly under his gaze. And I'm also 12 years old. What I like is taking care of my family's garden as well as spending time with my cousin and my little sister. Like Sensei, I also dislike unnecessary violence. As for my dream for the future. Several emotions flashed over her face, and while it was too quick for her teammate to follow, Itaka could recognize the unease and sadness just fine. But what would? I want to bring change to the Hyuga clan and abolish both the caged bird seal as well as the branch house system itself. So far, Hinata had seemed like the most reserved and subdued member of the team, her behavior stemming more from shyness and insecurity than the calm analytic behavior Shino demonstrated, but right now, that couldn't be any further from the truth. For just this moment, Hinata looked much more determined and motivated than even the much more expressive Kiba. That is an admirable dream, he told her, sincerely impressed. After all, being the heir of a similar rigid and traditional clan meant he understood very well just how difficult achieving her goal would be. And you're aware that this won't be easy. Of course. There was no hesitation and that was even more impressive doubt to be found in her voice when she replied. Good. If you know that, you just might actually succeed. It would definitively be a good thing for the village if she did, too. She gave him a bright smile that shone with genuine gratitude, making him suspect that he might very well be the first person who ever told her that she actually had a chance to make her dream come true, but it quickly faltered when she noticed the looks her two teammates were giving her. Hinata started to become red in the face, but Shino spoke up before she had the chance to say anything. I'm really impressed, Hyuga-san. I thought my own goal was ambitious, but it pales to yours. If there's anything I can do to help, please don't hesitate to ask. The expression on Hinata's face was priceless as she stared at Shino with no idea of how to reply. That's, well dash. He's right. Kiba exclaimed from her other side, making her jerk around in surprise. That's a real cool dream. Same as with Shino, if there's anything I can do, count me in. There was something odd in his voice as he said that, but Itachi recognized it for what it was easily enough. It wasn't much of a problem, though, so he decided not to address it for now and let things play out uninterrupted. Kiba-kun too. He waved her off. Well, of course. How could I hear you say something like that and not want to help? Also, stop with that kun, yes? It's weird being so formal when we're on the same team, isn't it? The same goes for me, Shino agreed before Hinata had the chance to reply. Why? Kiba and I already know each other, so it would be strange if you were the only one to address us with honorifics. Hinata still looked somewhat overwhelmed, but she had a smile on her face when she finally replied while giving a small bow. Then please call me just Hinata as well. Itachi decided this was as good a time as any to get the conversation back on track, so before they could deviate any further, he addressed Shino directly. You mentioned that her dream is even more ambitious than yours, didn't you? Why don't we continue with your introduction and you tell us more about it? Of course, he immediately agreed. My name is Shino Abarame and I am, just like Hinata and Kiba, 12 years old. I like exploring the forests around Konoha with my father, and I dislike people that make a nuisance of themselves. He then straightened up just so slightly. My dream is to make everyone in the village acknowledge and respect the Abarame clan for its strength rather than consider us little more than a joke. Many people did think rather lowly of them, that was true. He could see why Shino would think of his dream as ambitious. However, as someone who has worked with members of your clan before, I can tell you that your goal isn't as impossible to achieve as you might think, he said while making sure to catch his eyes behind his glasses. I'm confident that as long as you really try, you will be able to make it become reality. Itachi then pointed at the boy's teammates with an amused smile on his face. And judging from the looks of it, you will have plenty of help as well. Kiba and Hinata nodded enthusiastically at that. I appreciate that. While Shino clearly tried to play it cool, he had the misfortune of rather pale skin, so the blush on his cheeks was impossible to miss even with the high collar of his coat hiding parts of it. Watching them acting like this, Itachi began to think that his test was probably redundant already. After all, he had wanted to see how observant they were and how well they would work as a team, but he had technically already seen enough to confirm that they were more than suitable to become fully fledged genin. Well, there's no harm in another small training exercise, I suppose. He suppressed an amused chuckle. Time to put on a show, then. All right, he said, catching his three students' attention once more. With that out of the way, let's get on with your final test, shall we? When Itachi Uchiha entered their classroom, Shino could hardly believe it. Yes, he had met him a handful of times in the past due to his association with Sasuke, but the most he had ever interacted with the man was exchanging polite greeting, and even that happened so rarely that he could count the times on one hand and still have fingers left. There were a number of names that everyone in Konoha simply knew. The 4 Hokage, the 3 Sunin, Kakashi Hatake, and Shisui Uchiha, to name just a few. The important thing was that Itachi Uchiha was one of these names as well. Where the other names Shino could think of mostly belonged to legends, their fame came from deeds long in the past. Even Shisui Uchiha and Kakashi Hatake, those who had risen to fame in more recent times, hadn't made much of a ruckus in quite a while. Itachi Uchiha, on the other hand, was different. Although it was never officially confirmed, everyone knew about how he found himself in the war-torn land of water during his very first mission as a genin when he was only 7 years old, during which he somehow created the groundwork on which Konoha's current alliance with Kiri was built. Everyone had heard about how his breathtaking performance during his Chunin exams, just like everyone still talked about how his fight during the finals was the most exciting one in the history of the Chunin exams. And while nobody could find out anything specific, everyone had of course also heard about that collaboration mission with Kiri during which they encountered not only 1 or 2 but 5 S-rank Nukenin. Such high-ranked shinobi were rare in the world, and encountering them usually ended in death, so to not only survive but also bring 3 corpses with them had naturally been the only thing people in the village and most likely on the continent at large as well had been talking about for weeks. The list could go on and on, which was exactly what made Itachi Uchiha's name so famous. While other famed shinobi were revered for things they had done a long time ago, his deeds were not only relatively recent but also kept coming. Shino liked to think of himself as rather intelligent, but one didn't need to be all that clever to understand why the Uchiha was here. After all, Iruka-sensei had told them mere minutes ago that their future instructors would collect them one after another. And while Shino told himself that he shouldn't get his hopes up, he knew he was thinking the exact same thing as everyone else who had understood the implications of his presence in their classroom. Please let it be me. Still, when it actually turned out that he would indeed be his sensei, rather than being overwhelmed with joy, his brain just stopped. His feet moved on their own to follow behind his teammates to the training ground they were supposed to go to, but he couldn't think of anything but the fact that he would study under Itachi Uchiha of all people. Shino always knew that his best bet to become stronger was to study under a strong Jonin, but a part of him had been afraid that even that wouldn't be enough. That he would never become strong enough to make everyone respect him and his clan. But if it was this Jonin, maybe my dream can really become true. That was the only thing on his mind for the entire run to the training ground, and it was only when he fell to his knees on the soft grass once he arrived there that he came back to the present. The subsequent introductions gave him even more hope. He already knew Kiba, so while he was more than aware of how annoying the other boy could be, he also knew about his loyalty and determination, so he was content with him as a teammate. Hinata, too, had been a stroke of luck. While her written tests weren't quite as good as Sakura's or Ino's and generally tended to be on the lower end of the top 10 of their class, she was definitively the strongest kunoichi in terms of fighting prowess. In fact, she was always competing with Naruto and Kiba for the top spot behind Sasuke, and Shino personally thought she might have actually secured the position as second best if she weren't so hesitant in her fights. If she could overcome that, well, needless to say, she would be an ally to be reckoned with, and if the determination she showed when she spoke about her dream was anything to go by, he was confident she could do that. Now add to that the fact that the abilities of the three of them complemented each other and one could see that their team had quite a lot of potential. However, it was what came after the introduction that gave him pause. Alright then. With that out of the way, let's get on with your final test, shall we? Their sensei had told them earlier that there would be another test, so this was technically not much of a surprise, and yet something about his voice rang alarm bells in Shino's head. Judging from Kiba's frown and even Akamaru's low whimpering, they felt it as well, and as the two of them had probably the best instincts of their team, Shino's gut feeling must be justified. Itachi's next words proved that suspicion right. Simply put, you three will fight me. Shino could hear Hinata's soft gasp and Kiba's exclamation of surprise, but all he could do was stare at their sensei with barely restrained shock. There was no way they could beat him, and all of them knew it. Think, he told himself. He wouldn't give us a test we can't possibly pass, so there must be another objective. His eyes widened behind his glasses as the realization hit him. But the goal isn't to actually beat you, is it, sensei? Itachi nodded at him, clearly satisfied. Correct. Instead, your only objectives will be to prevent yourself from being incapacitated and to show me the full extent of your abilities. Should all three of you be unable to continue, the fight ends with your loss. You have time until the sun rises to its zenith. Should even just one of you still be on your feet by then, it's your victory. Shino looked up at the sky. So we need to endure this for about an hour, then? Time was against them under these conditions, so it was a good thing that they wouldn't need to fight for too long, but he knew that even 1 hour was much more than they could likely handle. He wants to test our abilities, though, so it's likely that he won't eliminate us immediately and instead wait to see what we can do. If we use that against him, we. Furthermore, my decision on whether or not to accept you as my team will depend on your performance, so you better hold nothing back. And with that, all of his plans fell apart before they could even fully form. What? Kiba cried while jumping to his feet. What do you mean? We're genin, aren't we? So far, Itachi's smile had been nothing but gentle and maybe slightly amused, but when he answered Kiba now, Shino couldn't help but think that there was something almost sinister to it. Unfortunately for you, the exams as the academy are only meant to weed out those that aren't fit to become a shinobi. As your prospective Jonin instructor, the final decision on your promotion rests with me. If you lose this fight, you're going back to the academy. If you win and impress me enough, I will accept you as my students. Similarly, if I'm not impressed, you're going back to the academy, too. It's simple, really. The three of them looked at each other, and Shino was sure the shock on his teammates' faces was mirrored on his own. He usually preferred to keep a calm facade in order to keep a calm head as well, but how could anyone stay calm after hearing such news? I should also mention that depending on your performance, I might decide to not take all three of you as my students. Depending on how you do respectively, I might just as well choose to take only two of you under my wings. Possibly even just one, two. Then, before either of them could respond, he gave them another smile that sent shivers down Shino's spine. That should be all, I think. I wish you the best of luck. And with that, he vanished in a puff of smoke. The three of them silently stared, or in Kiba's case, gaped at the spot he had vanished for several seconds before Shino managed to tentatively get a grip on himself. I should have put a female Kikaichu on him, he chided himself. He wouldn't be able to hide from me if I did. This wasn't the time for regrets, however. Hinata, he said. Kiba. Can you locate him? Although they were still pale, his voice thankfully seemed to jerk them back into the present. He's standing in a tree about 100 meters west of us, Hinata said a few moments later, quickly backed up by a nodding Kiba. Then, she shuddered, and when she continued, she sounded incredulous. I think no, he is definitively looking me straight in the eye. How is that even possible? Shino wanted to scream, but he swallowed that impulse down before it could get the better of him. No matter how ridiculous it sounded that he was somehow looking in the eye of a Byakugan user from 100 meters away, he couldn't let that distract himself. We retreat, he decided while patting himself on the shoulder for keeping his voice so steady. We won't be able to attack him head-on, and if we want to prepare an ambush, he can't know where we are. To his silent surprise, neither disagreed with him and both followed him when he began running away. Under different circumstances, he might have found some gratification in the fact that they followed him so readily, but right now, he didn't have the time or energy to do so. Every ounce of his attention was focused on coming up with a strategy, on coming up with a way that would allow not only him but all three of them to pass this test, but he came out blank. They could try to lay out a trap, but that would require Ataka-sensei to actually leave his position. It was they who needed to prove themselves, however, not him, so he had no reason to do that. Also, the chances of a trap even working in the first place were about zero, so it would only be a waste of time anyway. They could also try to just attack him head-on, it would certainly be unexpected and thus might give them a slight advantage. Unfortunately, while that gave them the chance to impress him, they would inevitably be beaten and sent back to the academy, so this approach was out as well. But maybe if we attack him with only two of us. After all, they would only lose if all three of them were beaten. If one person stayed back, the team itself would technically still be able to pass even if the other two lost. The problem with this plan was that the one person who stayed back wouldn't have the opportunity to impress their sensei and thus squander their chances of being promoted. Seriously, who would agree to that? As much as Shino wanted his teammates to succeed, he certainly wasn't ready to sacrifice himself for them. Then again, he thought. Maybe this act of self-sacrifice would impress Sensei just as much as a good performance in a fight. It might be even more impressive from a certain point of view, really. Then another thought struck him, making him frown. Well, either that or he will be disappointed because I sacrificed my teammates by sending them ahead while I stayed back. Needless to say, that idea was quickly discarded as well. Another possible approach was, man, this sucks. We can't just keep running away and do nothing. How could that possibly impress him? Shino shot Kiba a dark look over his glasses, but rather than backing off like he usually did, the other boy glared right back at him. What? He said, his tone challenging. You disagree? I don't know about you, but I actually want to become a genin. I'm trying to come up with a plan dash. Well, then try harder. He tried to stay calm, he really did. But that aggravating growling from both Kiba and Akamaru annoyed him more than he liked to admit, and if the angry buzz of insects around him was anything to go by, his colony was already responding independently to his mood. Why don't you try to come up with something instead if you think it's so easy? Sure. I say we attack him and are done with it. Shino scoffed. He couldn't believe he had thought being on a team with Kiba might be alright a mere few minutes ago. To get beaten in 30 seconds flat, you mean? It's better than running away and doing nothing. We're not running away. We merely keep our distance while coming up with a plan to dash. Kmin, do you really think we can come up with something he wouldn't be able to predict? Fortunately for everyone involved, Hinata interrupted their fight with soft but firm words. I think Kiba is right, Shino. He would have long since raised his voice if he had any less self-control than he did. A very brave statement. Some might call it foolish, even. What did you just say, you dash? Kiba, Hinata interrupted the boy, catching not only him but Shino as well off guard with her stern tone. Even as she looked supremely uncomfortable with the attention of both of them focused solely on her, she held her ground. Fighting among ourselves is useless. We are outmatched as it is, so we really shouldn't lower our chances even further, right? Shino and Kiba looked at each other, annoyance reeking from both of them, but ultimately, they nodded unhappily at each other. Hinata did have a point, even if they didn't like to admit it. It was only then that she continued. Kiba is right in that we won't come up with anything Ataka-sensei wouldn't be able to predict, but as Shino said, we also can't just attack him and hope for the best. However, what if only two of us attack him? Shino almost groaned. A part of him had hoped that she might have an actual plan, so having her propose something he already dismissed was rather annoying. Unexpectedly enough, Kiba seemed to understand the problem with that plan as well. Hinata, he said, his voice much calmer than it had been barely a minute ago. That would save the team, sure, but the person who stays back would dash. Forfeit their chance to impress Ataka-sensei and consequently fail to become a genin, yes. He was sure his expression must be just as surprised as Kiba's. If she knew that, why would she dash? I will do it. What? What? It didn't happen often for him to exclaim something or to gape in shock at others, but right now, both happened at the same time. And how couldn't he? After all, what Hinata just did was synonym with giving up on becoming a genin altogether. Who would do such a thing? But why? Shino was glad that Kiba had asked that first, as he wasn't sure he would be able to get a word out. This is the best, no, the only way we have, right? If we don't do this, none of us will become genin. At least you two will be able to graduate this way, and if the price for that is me going back to the academy for another year, that's still better than all three of us doing so. And then she gave them both an impossibly kind smile that made Shino feel like the greatest scumbag on earth for not immediately offering to be the one that was sacrificed instead. That's what he should do, he thought. Hadn't he been thinking about the others following him not too long ago? That made him something like the unofficial leader of their group, even if only a temporary one, which meant it would be his duty to sacrifice himself for them, right? However, all Shino did was whisper a soft thank you that he knew wasn't equal compensation for what she offered to do. From Kiba's crestfallen face as he followed suit in an uncharacteristically subdued tone, he knew the other boy must feel just as bad as he did. And yet neither of them offered to take her place. Even if we don't have a concrete plan, we should at least have some kind of strategy before we challenge Ataka-sensei. Kiba looked at him with open relief on his face at having something to distract him from his thoughts. Yeah, you're right. He gave him what probably was supposed to be a fierce grin but looked more like a pained grimace. So, any ideas? Even as they began to plan their attack, Shino couldn't quite push away the guilt that was eating him on the inside. What a terrible distraction. Their strategy, if it could even be called that, was simple. First, he would send big swarms of his Kikaichu at their sensei. That attack would certainly be useless in and on itself, of course, but as its main purpose was to shield them from his view for a few moments, that detail didn't matter much. Following that, he, Kiba, and Akamaru would attack him from two sides at once in hope of catching him even just a little bit off guard. That wasn't the end of their plan, however. While they tried to attract all of Ataka's attention, small groups of his Kikaicha would sneak up on him and hopefully manage to steal enough of his chakra to make a difference. Finding a balance between sending enough of them to be able to actually make a dent in his reserves and sending few enough to avoid detection wasn't an easy task, but Shino thought he could do it. They would not win this fight, both of them were aware of that, but with this strategy, they hoped to at least pull off a good show. Unfortunately, the moment they launched their attack, everything went to hell. The essential idea they had built their plan around was that their sensei wouldn't take them seriously. Aside from the fact that he couldn't test them if he just annihilated them in an instant, he must also be aware that he was much stronger than the three of them combined. Consequently, he wouldn't see the need of being cautious while fighting them. That assumption was quickly proven wrong when their combined attacks were put down without mercy. Shino had sent his insects in 3 swarms to attack him from several directions at once, and thanks to the dense forest they were fighting in, he had held hope that the cover of the trees would allow his Kikaicho to get close to him with ease. However, when they had crossed just about half the distance to their target, Itaka drew 3 kunai with attached explosive tags. A second later, almost all of his insects were killed in the following explosion. Now, it wasn't as if Shino had never lost insects in the past, but for so many to die at once, it wasn't a surprise that he momentarily froze on the spot, which in turn meant he missed his cue to attack and left Kiba to jump onto their sensei on his own. That might have been a blessing in disguise, though, as this way, he avoided being put down in an instant like Kiba was. Shino was in the perfect position to watch the entire debacle firsthand and didn't even need to think to realize that his presence wouldn't have made any difference at all. Kiba and Akamaru came at Itaki in a pincer attack with a cry of Gachuga on the former's lips, but before they could even reach him, their sensei appeared in front of them and grabbed them by their collars, somehow managing to do so even though they were rotating at high speed, before throwing them against a nearby tree. Akamaru's human transformation immediately dispelled and the two stayed lying groaning on the ground, still conscious but momentarily out of the fight. I need to retreat, Shino realized with rising panic. I stand no chance. Even if Kiba gets up again, the two of us would still be beaten. We need to. Won't you attack me as well? He was proud to say that his first reaction wasn't to freeze once more even though he hadn't noticed anyone sneaking up on him. Instead, he fell into the stance they had been taught at the academy and threw a textbook kick at the person behind him the moment the voice rang out. Not that it did him any good, mind you. Itaka blocked his kick just as easily as he did with his following punches without a care in the world before he grabbed him by his collar just like he had done with Kiba a few moments earlier and threw him towards where his teammate was just getting up to his knees. A moment later, they both tumbled across the ground in a jumble of limbs as he crashed into him. By the time they came to a stop and managed to disentangle themselves from each other, Itaka was already there, looming over them with a bored and much more important, disappointed look on his face. Is that it, then? Shino clenched his hands as he desperately tried to come up with some kind of plan. He couldn't lose here, couldn't allow himself to be sent back to the academy. How could he ever change people's perceptions about the Abarame clan if he couldn't even become a genin? There must be a way out, a way to. His thoughts were interrupted by a flash from the edge of his eye, and a second later, Itaka jumped away to avoid an incoming attack. Hinata! Kiba exclaimed what Shino was thinking. What are you doing here? You're supposed to dash. I'm going to buy you some time, she interrupted him, and if Shino wasn't imagining things, her voice was shaking just so slightly. I don't know how long I can keep him occupied, so run. Shino wasn't sure if it was this declaration in particular that finally snapped something inside of him or if it was just the accumulation of everything that had been happening in the last hour. However, in the end, the details weren't really important. The point was that he was done. Even his desperation to pass the test was suddenly not all that important anymore. He and Kiba had accepted it when Hinata proposed to sacrifice herself the first time, neither of them wanting to be the one that lost their chance to graduate by taking her place instead, but to do so a second time? Unthinkable. They had already lost their chance anyway if the look on their sensei's face had been anything to go by, so letting her sacrifice herself again in the hopes of maybe changing his mind simply wasn't an option. After all, while the two of them had pretty much lost every chance of impressing their sensei and becoming genin, Hinata could still do it. In fact, her actions so far might even be enough already to make her pass. She might not have demonstrated some awe-inspiring fighting abilities, but she did show her willingness to save him and Kiba at the cost of herself not only once but twice. That was very impressive in its own right. Itaki had also said he might let one of them pass even if the other two failed, so she might very well become his apprentice after this. Kiba dash. Yeah, I got it. He has come to the same decision, then, Shino thought, his mind unexpectedly calm all of the sudden. Good. That makes things easier. Hey, Akamaru, Kiba said without turning his gaze away from the waiting figure of their sensei a dozen meters in front of them. You know what to do, right? The dog made a whining sound as if it did know what Kiba was saying and didn't like it. However, that clearly didn't stop the dog from doing as it was told. Without any further delay, Akamaru once more transformed into a human copy of Kiba and rushed forwards. And rather than attacking Itachi, it grabbed a surprised Hinata, threw her over its shoulder, and started running away. Hey! Hinata exclaimed as she tried to escape Akamaru's grip without actually hurting him. What are you doing? Hey dash! Her screams quickly grew quieter and quieter before they faded into the distance altogether. So, Kiba said, his voice sounding oddly calm. I guess it's only the two of us now, eh? It appears like that, yes. Kiba chuckled. It's just like Sensei said, isn't it? We need to help each other if we don't want to fail. He shook his head in amusement. I didn't think he meant it like this, though. Shino was just about to reply when he suddenly froze. Just like Sensei said? What were his words again? It was almost an hour ago, but he remembered every single word of that particular lesson. When you're on a team with someone, you function as a unit. Your successes and failures are also the successes and failures of your teammates. If you don't help each other, you will suffer the consequences just as much as they do. Right now, that only means sharing the same punishment, but in the worst case, it can be what makes the difference between life and death. If one of them won, all of them would, and if one of them lost, all of them would as well. The only objectives they had been given were to prevent themselves from being incapacitated and to show their sensei the full extent of their abilities. Furthermore, the condition for their victory was to be still on their feet by the end of the time limit, and they had also explicitly been told that they didn't need to actually beat Itachi. And yet they had focused all their attention on demonstrating to him their abilities in a fight, focusing on the part where he told them that he would only take them as his team if their abilities were to his satisfaction. Now that I think about it, the fact that he specifically said as my team should have given us the hint that we can only pass this test together. Even more so considering he had also told them the importance of working as a team just a few moments before that. In hindsight, it was so obvious. All they would have needed to do to pass was to stay away from him until the time limit was over. Reading between the lines of what he had said and finding a way to successfully fulfill the objections he had set for them would certainly count as impressive, and doing so as a team would have proven that they understood the lesson he had tried to teach them, the lesson he had called the most important piece of advice they would ever receive in their career as a shinobi. It was almost funny that Hinata, the one who had given up on passing this test, was the only one who had thought of their team first. Hopefully Itachi-sensei will take her as his student even when Kiba and I fail, he thought with a defeated sigh. She certainly deserves it much more than we do. Shino was pretty convinced by now that Itachi never planned to take only one or two of them under his wings. It was either all of them or none of them. Sure, he had said he would accept even just one or two of them if they impressed them, but as they couldn't impress him without understanding his lesson about teamwork, the point was moot. The possibility existed in theory, yes, but it was impossible in praxis. Maybe if Kiba and I beg him to take her anyway, he might make an exception. After Hinata had tried so hard to help them, that was the least they could do. Regardless, Shino needed to focus on keeping him busy for now. It was a miracle that he had given them so much time to prepare as it was, so he really shouldn't push their luck. After all, they needed to buy as much time as possible. However, just when he wanted to tell Kiba that they should attack, a voice spoke up. The time isn't quite over yet, but I think I have seen enough. The voice clearly belonged to their sensei, but not only had he not moved his mouth, but the voice came from all around them as well. Then, before Shino had the chance to even think about how this was even possible, the world around them began to shake and twist until everything became an unrecognizable mess of colors. Shino found himself sitting heavily breathing on the grassy ground a moment later. More importantly, he was not alone, for Kiba and Hinata knelt on either side of him as well while their sensei stood before them. This is the place where we introduced ourselves, he realized with wide eyes. But how? Congratulations, Itachi interrupted his thoughts, his face once more showing a kind and gentle smile instead of the cold expression it had held before. "All three of you have passed." Shino blinked, and his emotions were once again plain to see on his face as he stared at the Jonin with undisguised shock. What? 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 Chapter 49, Graduation 4. Let's start this from the beginning. Graduation 4. Itaka let out a tired sigh as he stared at the stacks of paperwork in front of him. He had helped his parents with the bureaucratic aspect of leading a clan for some years now, something that he had never truly had the chance to do in the last timeline due to his duties in the Umbu being valued by his father much more at the time, but the novelty of it had long since worn off. He never complained, of course, and he was glad that he could take some burden from his parents' shoulders, but after sitting on these papers for as many hours as he did already, letters began to blur and his eyes started to complain about the never-ending burden of paperwork. It was a necessary evil, unfortunately. There were many things the head family of a clan such as the Uchiha needed to handle to guarantee that every of its member was taken care of, after all, and neglecting these duties would result in countless problems. The clan took care of the security of its members, and this included both their physical health as well as their financial welfare. Monetary aid for the less well-off families, partly cost coverage for medical care, and a regular pension were just some examples of that. Every such request needed to be checked individually and then answered regardless of whether they were accepted or not. Such things obviously cost a lot of money, and the only reason they were able to afford it was that the special position of the Uchiha clan in Konoha. Every clan had certain advantages like some plot of land that was at their disposal or entire districts in the village for their own, which was one of the reasons why there were so many civilian shinobi that grouped together to form clans of their own in the hopes of gaining enough members and consequently fame and influence to be granted such advantages as well. They were not related and officially weren't even registered as clans until they met certain conditions, but if they managed to become powerful enough to do so, the reward would be immense. One of those families that had almost managed to rise to that point in the recent past was the Heitake family. With Sakumo Heitake as their figurehead, they gained an extensive amount of fame and influence, and given just a few more years, they would have surely been recognized as a clan by both Konoha and the rest of the continent. Unfortunately, the man's fall from fame put an end to that dream, and everyone associated with him pulled away until all that remained today was Kakashi. If Itaki remembered correctly, many of Sakumo's former comrades and allies had actually approached his son once it became clear that he was not only a rising star in his own right but also close with the Yondaime and tried to relieve their old alliances. As one might expect, Kakashi had quite firmly turned them down. Anyway, there was still a distinction between normal clans and big clans. The latter ones were the most powerful and those that joined the village early on, and one of their advantages was that they didn't need to pay as many taxes. Furthermore, it was the heads of Konoha's four noble clans, the Aburame, Akimichi, Hyuga, and Uchiha, that made up the majority of the Hokage's closest council, giving them even more influence. The Uchiha in particular, however, were also one of the village's two founders and thus had even more of an advantage in that they were exempt from more taxes than even the other clans. This was something they once shared with the Senju before they went extinct. This allowed them to collect clan internal taxes, and almost all that money was then used for the benefit of the community. Unfortunately, organizing such a thing for almost 1,000 members involved a lot of paperwork, leading to Itaka's current predicament. At least Sasuke should take some of the work off my shoulders soon enough. Academy graduation was usually the time clan heirs began to actively help their parents, and while Sasuke was technically not the heir, most shinobi clans were smart enough to realize that their lifestyle was a dangerous one and that there was no guarantee that the firstborn would survive long enough to inherit the title. Second child or not, Sasuke would receive the education he would need in case he ever became clan head. He did have much less pressure than Itaki had, though, especially this timeline around, and he was glad for that. However, for now, he still needed to do the work by himself. That would usually be no big problem, but today, other things on his mind kept distracting him. To be more precise, he was thinking about his new students. His test earlier that day had been quite a surprise. After the initial introduction, Itaki's first impression had made him believe that they would pass the test without breaking a sweat. That even if they didn't see through its true meaning, they would successfully showcase their teamwork abilities. He realized now that he really should have known better than that, though, and that green youngsters barely ever acted like they were expected to. Even if they were good kids at their cores, they were still inexperienced and immature. Of course they wouldn't act as he thought they would. I have spent too much time with experienced Jonin and not enough with Sasuke and Naruto, it seems. At first, Itachi wanted to include Haku in that second category too, but he ultimately decided not to. She was much calmer and had much more common sense than her age might imply. That was quite different from his 3 new students, too. Shino was a smart kid, both his files and his actions towards the end of the test had shown that, but all his intelligence was of no use if he couldn't keep a cool head. He would need to see how the boy acted when put under a lot of stress that didn't directly endanger his dream to make people respect the Aburame name and, as Itachi suspected, his own as well. Nevertheless, that was a problem that he would need to address sooner rather than later. He would need to look after his mental health, too. While the untrained eye saw just a calm and controlled boy, Itachi was fairly sure he wasn't exactly dealing with and controlling his emotions but bottled them up inside of him instead. He couldn't be completely sure of that, of course, having not spent enough time with him yet to make a final assertion, but he was reasonably convinced that he was right. After all, he had more than enough experience with that himself. Kiba, on the other hand, had no problem expressing his emotions, though he had other shortcomings that would need to be addressed as well. In fact, his tendency to let his emotions run wild was a problem in and on itself. Inuzuka were generally more unrestrained than others and Itachi would need to take that into consideration, but at the very least, Kiba would need to learn to not let himself be controlled by them. Maybe Hana can help with that, he thought with a hum. She's uncharacteristically calm for a member of her clan, and if what Izumi said is true, she's also quite close to him as well. He had also been willing to sacrifice his teammate for his own gain, but Itachi didn't think he would need to do much if anything to avoid such a thing in the future. Inuzuka tended to be very loyal, so judging from the guilt that had been quite apparent on his face even when the joy of realizing that he had successfully become a genin took over his face, he would never do such a thing again. The only other thing that Itachi had to worry about with him was that he might develop some sort of inferiority complex. After all, he had looked quite down when the 3 of them introduced themselves and his teammates' dreams were objectively much more difficult and ambitious than his own. That was a silly thought in Itachi's mind because the only thing a dream could be measured by was how much it meant to the one dreaming it, but that was obviously not an easy concept to grasp for a 12-year-old. Hinata might prove to be the most difficult of his students. Funnily enough, she was also the only one who had acted as Itachi had expected by willingly putting her teammates before herself. He was reasonably sure she hadn't actually looked through his test and acted like this due to her personality alone, too, which theoretically meant that teamwork would come easily to her. Unfortunately, in this case, her willingness to sacrifice herself was actually the problem. She hadn't even tried to look for a deeper meaning in his test, hadn't even tried to work together with her team and search for a different way out, but had instantly jumped to the conclusion that would leave her as the only loser. Putting the team and the mission first wasn't a bad thing, but self-sacrifice should always be the absolute last choice rather than the first one. Other than that, there was one more thing about her that he hadn't observed himself but read in her file from her academy instructors. It was hard to say how much of a problem it would become, but apparently, Hinata tended to hesitate in finishing off her opponents in her spars. It never actually led to her own defeat as the difference in skills between her and her opponents tended to be too great for this behavior to matter, but if she fought someone as strong or even stronger than herself, well. From what he read, she was ranked 3rd in her class when it came to Taijutsu, coming just behind Naruto and then Sasuke. However, according to her teachers, the difference between her and the former wasn't too big, meaning if she were allowed to actually use her gentle fist to target her opponent's Tenketsu, she might be ranked even higher. Itachi didn't think she could beat Sasuke, knowing full well how advanced he was due to training him himself, and Naruto tended to surprise people with how resourceful he was all the time as well, but to be able to fight evenly with either of them was already an impressive feat for a freshly graduated genin. That only mattered if she actually used her skills without hesitation, though. I will just have to wait and see, he ultimately decided before gently shaking his head to banish these thoughts. Thinking about any of this right now is useless. There will be more than enough time to do so later, preferably after I learned to know them a bit better. For now, he would need to concentrate on the paperwork in front of him. The sooner he could finish it, the better. Anko watched the piece of flesh on the table in front of her with keen eyes, not even daring to blink no matter how dry they became as she slowly but surely brought the pipette with her good hand to hover above it. Everything else faded away, and even the countless symbols she had painstakingly drawn onto the table on which the flesh lay on blurred until they weren't recognizable anymore. Then she allowed a drop of the liquid to drop out of the pipette. At first, nothing happened, but that was to be expected. After all, if her experiments so far had demonstrated anything, then it was that immediate results usually meant that something had gone wrong. Several moments went by without any reaction, and just when Anko began to hope that this might finally be the breakthrough she had been waiting for, the symbols began to glow. She had less than a second to leap away and take cover behind a purposefully reinforced wall to her right before the table burst into flames. Anko suppressed a sigh, not even having the energy to curse. So this substance has been a failure as well, huh? She peered past the wall to look at the battered table. I guess we should invest in some new equipment again soon. That had been the 28th experiment so far, and as all of them ended in similar a fashion to this one, tables didn't tend to survive long. This one, for example, she had bought less than 2 months ago, and even though it was a specifically reinforced metal table for the single purpose of serving as the base for her experiments, it was already covered with dents and burn marks. But I really thought this might be it. Fuinjutsu was a complicated thing, so she hadn't expected to find a cure to Orochimaru's cursed seal in a short amount of time, but it had already been years and she felt barely any closer to a solution than she did when she first began her research. She was thankful for Jiraiya's help in teaching her the basics and for the Sandame's willingness to share both his own knowledge as well as Konoha's records on that subject with her, but what use was all of that if she couldn't deliver any results? The main problem with Fuinjutsu was that it was unbelievably complex. Even the most simple seals were difficult to create and couldn't be done by an amateur. Explosive tags, for example, were the easiest seals imaginable as all they really did was blow up after being overloaded with too much chakra. However, even so, academy students spent months learning how to create them under the strict oversight of their teachers. The only other somewhat commonly used seal was the storage seal, and that one was only taught to genin under one-to-one supervision from their senseis. What made Fuinjutsu so difficult was that there were very few rules to it that could be generally applied. Pretty much every seal was unique and thus needed to be learned separately. Furthermore, even if someone technically knew the symbols they needed to draw for a seal, they couldn't actually create it unless they knew how much chakra to inject into the ink while drawing them. That was the crux of the problem. While the symbols themselves were still important, even a single wrong brush or a line an inch too long could result in unwanted explosions, and needed to be drawn with the greatest care. Everything was useless if the amount of chakra injected into it was wrong. Just a bit too much or a bit too little could easily lead to the practitioner's death. And unfortunately, such information was impossible to put down in writing, making it all but impossible to learn Fuinjutsu from scrolls alone and requiring an actual teacher to pass the knowledge down. It was this reason that made the downfall of Uzashigakure so terrible. No matter how much knowledge was rescued from its ruins, without its inhabitants, most of its teachings were lost. What Anko wanted to say with all of that was that finding something that could destroy Orochimaru's cursed seal without killing her was a goal many would consider impossible. In truth, even she herself had often thought that maybe she should just give up on it and try to live with it. Not that she would ever admit that out loud, mind you, but the doubt plagued her mind on a daily basis, and it was always particularly bad after a failed experiment. She couldn't give up, however. Not as long as that seal made it impossible for her to use Sage Mode. Just the memory of the one time she used it after having recovered from her injuries as much as she ever would made her shudder. The pain had been unbearable and fighting in such a state was completely out of question. It was bad enough that her left arm was in the state it was, being almost but not quite as strong and deft as she wanted it to. Losing her trump card as well was out of the question. Anko, what do you think you're doing? She flinched before turning around with a tight smile and a nervous chuckle while she raised her hand to scratch the back of her head. Shizun, she said, unhappily noting that her voice was an octave too high. What are you doing here? I thought you dash. The other woman shot her an unimpressed look and crossed her arms as she interrupted her. Well, I thought we had planned to do this experiment together in. She looked at the clock on the wall. About 10 minutes. What were you thinking doing it on your own? What if something went wrong and you got injured while nobody was here? Anko could deal with anger, that was easy. Disappointment and worry, on the other hand, was much more difficult. I'm sorry, she said while casting her gaze down, genuinely feeling bad. Tsunade and Shizun had generously allowed her to use the faculties beneath the hospital for her experiments, and the latter even spent much of her free time down here with her to help, so making her worry was the last thing Anko wanted. I guess I didn't think about it. Exactly, Shizun said. You didn't think. Her voice then thankfully grew a bit softer. I don't want to come down here one day and find your corpse, you know. I know. So you won't do any more experiments on your own? I won't. Good. Anko blinked. There's no way that's it, right? However, apparently it actually was. Well then, Shizun continued, suddenly sounding much more upbeat, making for an odd contrast with her previous bad mood. If we aren't doing any experiments today, let's get something to eat. Wadash. Anko had no time to react before Shizun grabbed her arm and began pulling her out of the room, not giving her a choice on that matter. I overheard Kurane mention that she wanted to go for lunch just a few minutes before I came here, so let's go join her, shall we? Although she was half-heartedly complaining, Anko didn't put up much of a fight. She knew what Shizun was doing, after all, and after having made her worry, going along with her plan was the least Anko could do. Her friend knew her long enough by now to understand how disappointed she was by each failed experiment, and she had long since got into the habit of trying to distract her in the aftermath of each and every single one of them. Sometimes, she even succeeded. Anko wasn't really hungry, but she hadn't eaten since breakfast either, so it was probably better to get some substance anyway. Just no flesh, she thought sardonically. I had enough of that for a while, I think. Kiba had been a bit uncertain about what to think when it turned out that his sensei would be Itachi Uchiha, but at first, he had been optimistic. After all, he would surely learn a lot from such a renowned shinobi, right? He had heard not only the usual tales everyone in the village knew but some stuff from his sister whose friend was an Uchiha herself as well, so he was pretty sure he had a good idea of how impressive the man was. How could he not become a great shinobi under his tutelage? Sure, he briefly changed his mind when he told them about the final test they would need to pass. How could they win a fight against him, damn it? And how he could send them back to the academy if they didn't meet his expectations, but in the end, his first impression seemed to have been the correct one. Kiba hadn't quite understood the specifics of the test until after their sensei asked Shino to explain it to him and Hinata, but afterwards, he was sold. As if it wasn't already impressive enough that he had caught all three of them in a genjutsu from the very beginning, devising such a well-thought-out plan was simply genius. Seriously, how awesome was that? Needless to say, he had looked forward to their first training session. They would probably not be taught any super cool techniques quite yet, and if what some of the older kids of his clan said was right, focus instead of teamwork for a while, but that was alright with him. They would just need to breeze through that and prove that they were ready for more. If he were to take a guess, he would give their sensei a week before he realized that they had teamwork in the bag already. Kiba had been so excited for this training session that he actually forgot about all his worries for a bit, whether it was how childish his dream sounded to him now or how guilty he felt over almost throwing Hinata under the cart. It just didn't matter at that moment. Unfortunately, he was quickly given a reality check. Training started normally enough. Some warming up and some stretching while their sensei asked them questions about what kind of experiences they had and what they thought their strengths and weaknesses were, that's all. Nothing special. Sure, he was a bit miffed to admitting to his weakness against genjutsu and his tendency to rush into things without thinking them through in front of the other two, but it was fine. After his shit-poor show yesterday, this was the least he could do. And besides, Shino seemed much more annoyed about admitting his troubles with taijutsu, so Kiba really couldn't complain. It was afterwards that things started to go south, though. We're supposed to do what now? Alright, so what if he blurted that out without thinking about it when he had promised himself earlier to not do such a thing? That order was stupid. And while Shino looked as impassive as ever, even Hinata seemed to think so, although he was sure she wouldn't say it out loud like he had done. You will learn to fight even if one of your senses is impaired, Itachi-sensei patiently repeated himself, his expression not wavering one bit. That means without your sense of smell or Akamaru's help for you in particular, while Hinata will have her eyes bound during this part of today's training. He then turned towards Shino. You will obviously not use your insects either. I will notice if you do, so I recommend not even trying to. Furthermore, you will plug your ears as well. Much to Kiba's chagrin, Shino merely nodded as if that was no big deal. And Hinata, too, nodded after a moment of hesitation without complaining one bit. The only one who seemed to be as bothered by this as he was Akamaru, but even his companion stayed silent. Kiba knew Akamaru had already accepted Itachi-sensei as the leader and wouldn't dare go against him, but come on. Even he left him alone? Really? He wanted to fight some more, wanted to scream how stupid this was, but he painfully kept his mouth shut. He had promised himself to get a grasp on himself, after all. Furthermore, while Itachi-sensei's face showed a pleasant smile, his instincts told him that it would be wise to stand down now. It was frustrating that he couldn't tell what he was thinking, as he usually had a good idea about such things depending on how people were smelling. People would honestly be surprised if they knew how much one could learn from their smell alone. It was a bit harder when he couldn't see someone's face, like in cases like Shino, as he used facial clues to better understand what his nose was telling him, but he had at least an idea even then. His sensei, on the other hand, was a blank slate. A void in the air entirely devoid of smell. It was maddening as it was intriguing, and Kiba had no idea how he was doing it. In all honesty, it was probably this fact that made him respect the man the most. All right, he finally said once he was sure he was in full control of his tongue, trying not to feel too proud of himself when he saw the approving glint in his sensei's eyes. And why exactly are we doing that? I mean, my nose, Hinata's eyes, and Shino's insects are our strongest assets, right? Shouldn't we train them even more rather than training them less? Very good question. He turned towards the other two. Does either of you want to answer? Hinata was the first one to reply. It's possible that we get hurt in a fight and lose one or more of our senses because of an injury, right? She hesitated for a second. Our opponent would expect to gain an advantage because of that, I think, so if we know how to fight without whatever sense got impaired, we might be able to catch them off guard. While her outwardly behavior was only the slightest bit hesitant, Kiba could smell the anxiety that radiated from her. It wasn't terribly much, but still a lot more than what he thought would be appropriate. It was confusing, though, as he didn't think she had anything to worry about. Either she got it wrong and sensei corrected her, or she got it right as she did and that was it, right? It also made him wonder how this was the same person that had spoken so passionately about changing the Hayagawa clan, whose members generally had a stick up their ass and were averse to change. Well done, Itachi-sensei said, and Hinata positively glowed at the warm praise as her anxiety was replaced by delight. That's mostly it, yes. There is one more detail, though. Does anyone know what it is? There were a few moments of silence as the three of them thought about it before Shino finally spoke up. It's to cover our weaknesses, is it not? As Kiba already said, the aforementioned senses are our greatest assets, so we depend on them. If they were taken from us unprepared, we would undoubtedly lose, so learning to fight without them is essential in being prepared for that eventuality. Their sensei nodded, clearly satisfied with that answer. That is correct. Everyone depends on their senses, of course, but we four share the peculiarity of being part of clans that bestowed upon us abilities that only reinforces that habit. More than any regular shinobi, we depend on those skills unique to our families, making us even more vulnerable to losing them than any of them ever would be. Even you, sensei. Kiba was thankful that Hinata asked the question before he did, not wanting to stand out as the one who couldn't keep his mouth shut again, but he didn't seem to mind the interruption. Of course, he said. I said we four, didn't I? Just as any Uchiha, I'm proud to bear my clan's Kekkei Genkai, and I couldn't imagine a life without it. However, I also always made sure to train without it, or even without my vision at all, sometimes in case the unlikely happens and I lose my eyes. It doesn't hurt to be prepared for every eventuality, after all. The three of them looked at each other. If he couldn't tell that they were thinking the same thing he did, Kiba would have been embarrassed by never thinking of it that way. Heck, it was so obvious now that it was spelt out in front of him. "Alright, listen up," Itachi-sensei said, probably realizing that they were inwardly beating themselves up and wanting to distract him. "What I'm going to tell you now will be essential for not only your training but your career as a whole, so make sure you pay attention." Kiba shared one last look with his teammates before swallowing hard and focusing all his attention on his sensei. Every technique has strengths and weaknesses, and so have the people performing them. Nobody is perfect. Nobody is unbeatable. You need to be able to see through them, analyze their attacks, find their flaws, and you need to do so before they can do the same with you. That is how you win a fight against someone as strong or sometimes even stronger than you. However, how can you do that if you don't even know your own weaknesses and strengths? How can you find weak spots in other people's attacks if you can't do the same with your own? How can you prepare for your own vulnerabilities if you are not even aware of them? As a shinobi or kunoichi, you will inevitably end up facing many opponents. If you can't size them up quickly and efficiently, can't correctly gauge their abilities, you will die. Be aware of them and yourself both, weigh your skills against theirs, decide which one of you is stronger, and make your decision based on the conclusion you arrive at. If you come out on top, that's good. Don't underestimate them, play to your strengths and their weaknesses, and you will win. If you are weaker, however, you will need to make a decision. Do you think you can overcome your opponent even though he's in an advantageous position? Is that fight worth risking your life to begin with, or is the mission too important to give up on? Are you actually and truly prepared to die? The first step to doing any of that is to learn about yourselves and to make up for your shortcomings as much as you can, for if you do that, your opponents won't be able to exploit them. His mouth was dry and his eyes were wide. That was much more than anything he had expected. How did they get from fighting without one of your senses to measure your skills against those of others to survive? Shino and Hinata seemed just as flabbergasted as he was, but he couldn't even enjoy that fact as he was too preoccupied gaping at their sensei. He, in turn, seemed to realize that he had caught them by surprise, so when he continued, he did so much gentler and without the serious air around him. "You're still only genin, of course, so no one expects you to do any of that quite yet," he said. "It's my job to teach you these skills, and I promise that I will do so. You were assigned to me to learn such things, after all. And although it is impossible in this world we live in to say anything with absolute certainty, I assure you that I will do everything in my power to ensure that you are never put in a position where you are forced to make the decision I spoke of as long as I am still breathing." And somehow, that was actually reassuring. Their sensei was one of the strongest shinobi alive, so if he said he would protect them with his life, well, what could possibly happen to them? And if he said he would teach them how to survive on their own, there was no doubt that he would actually do it. They had really gotten lucky with their sensei. Sure, what he said had been rather scary. Kiba could admit that, even if only in the privacy of his mind. However, even more than that, he was excited. This was what he would need to become stronger and he couldn't wait to master it. "All right," he exclaimed while throwing his fist in the air and ignoring his teammates' startled looks. "Let's start with the training, sensei. We're already all fired up. Isn't that right, Akamaru?" His companion's excited bark was all the answer he needed. Kiba promised himself that he would make up for his poor show during the test. He would soak up everything Itachi-sensei taught them, become stronger, and make everyone forget about his previous shortcomings. So what if he had no impressive dream like they did? He would show them that his resolve was just as great as theirs. He would prove that he had learned from his poor demonstration during the test and that he deserved to be here just as much as they did. "Just you wait," he thought with a fierce, excited grin. "I will show you all." Chapter 50, Graduation V. Let's start this from the beginning. Graduation V. After 3 weeks of being the instructor of Team 8, Itachi was confident that he had a pretty good understanding of all his charges. That obviously wasn't to say that he knew all their secrets or that they couldn't still surprise him, but at the very least, he had an idea of what to expect from them by now. After all, he was a shinobi and, as he had explained to them a while ago, asserting others came with the territory. That being said, Itake's current evaluation of them was surprisingly uniform and simultaneously quite different from what he had initially expected. Let's take their last few D-rank missions, for example. While none of them was too impressed by doing odd jobs that were generally not associated with shinobi, they did not only accept their duties with no more than minimal complaining, which had been particularly unexpected in the case of Kiba, but also approached their tasks seriously. Even something as banal as babysitting or walking dogs a mission Itake chose only once before deciding that it was way too easy, with Kiba and Akamaru being there to rein in even the most disobedient dogs without breaking a sweat was taken as seriously as if they were real missions in the field. Considering he had heard his fellow instructors complain about their students' attitudes and even experienced some of it firsthand in the past thanks to Sasuke and Naruto, Itake really had nothing to complain about. Moreover, they also carried this attitude over to their training sessions. There might be some grumbling when he gave them a particularly annoying task, his condition training being especially unpopular, but ever since he had explained the significance of training without their clan techniques during their first session, that was all the complaining they did. Itake had approvingly noted that all of them also spent a lot of time either thinking about or even discussing with each other what meaning might be hidden behind every one of his exercises. It was somewhat amusing to him, though, as a number of exercises they thought had a deep and meaningful secret were nothing but simple workouts intended on improving their physics, something Shino in particular seemed very happy about. Not that he would tell them that. After all, it was a good mental exercise in its own right. A shinobi needs to see what's underneath the underneath, as Kakashi would phrase it. The three of them also showed great teamwork during their training spars, the lesson he taught them during their initial test obviously having set in. However, somewhat ironically, it was also here that the problems began. Even more ironically, the root of one of the problems could be found in Itake's test as well. Their teamwork when the three of them sparred against him was great. They covered each other masterfully and combined their attacks more and more cunning with each passing day, but that was only so long as Itake stayed on the defensive. Once he decided to actively push back, things began to go south. Oh, it wasn't anything like when Shino and Kiba decided to sacrifice Hinata. Not at all. In fact, it was probably the exact opposite. Instead of using her to get an advantage, the two boys in his team suddenly became overprotective to the point where they at least partially forgot about common sense and took unnecessary risks that ultimately lost them the fight. Shino's generally more calm and thought-through fighting style limited the damage this behavior had somewhat, but Kiba wasn't so fortunate, and he tended to literally jump between Itake and Hinata as soon as he thought she was in danger without a plan. Needless to say, that never worked out well for him. It admittedly irked Itake a bit that it was his initial approach that had resulted in their current attitude. Had he used another test instead, this problem would probably never come up. He couldn't change the past, however, so all he could do was deal with it as it was. So far, he had limited himself to subtle hints while he waited to see if the boys recognized their shortcomings themselves or whether Hinata stepped forward to make them see reason, but unfortunately, neither of these things had happened yet. Itake thought Shino had begun to realize the problem, at least, and he had seen the boy visibly struggling with suppressing the instinct to make up for his actions during the test and help Hinata for a few days now, but that wasn't enough. Itake found it important to give them the chance to realize their mistakes by themselves and let them grow without him holding their hands all the time, but that could only go so far. If he waited any longer, this as of yet harmless habit might become a permanent problem that could even cause their deaths in the field at some point. He had given them more than enough time, and now it was time for him to act. It's unfortunate that just telling them won't be enough, Itake thought with a small sigh while he watched his three charges paint a fence from a nearby rooftop. With things like this, people need to see that they're wrong rather than just being told that they are. Aside from them obviously feeling bad about their actions during Itake's test, the main reason for why they acted as they did was likely because they didn't fully understand just how capable Hinata actually was, and no, the irony of them trying to protect her when she was currently probably the strongest member of their team wasn't lost on Itake. Consequently, an important first step would be to demonstrate her abilities to them in a way that appeared natural. In all honesty, as things stood now, he couldn't truly fault Shino and Kiba for underestimating Hinata. Itake had read in Hinata's file that she had a problem with hesitating during spars at the academy. It hadn't been very important at the time as she was clearly the top kunoichi in terms of taijutsu in her class. The general consensus was that her hesitation came from using the gentle fist fighting style without actually being allowed to seal her opponent's tenketsu. Using clan techniques was forbidden during academy spars, after all, and that this problem would solve itself once she graduated. However, Itaka could now confidently say that this wasn't the case. If anything, being allowed to use the gentle fist to its fullest extent seemed to make things even worse. It had honestly thrown him off at first. When fighting against him, there was no hesitation whatsoever in her movements, while her attacks were quick and strong. He could see in the way she held herself that she had spent countless hours going through every single form of her family's fighting style, that she had repeated every attack again and again until she could utilize them without even thinking about it, and he was also sure that she regularly sparred against someone, probably a family member around her age, who was more advanced than she was. However, as soon as he put her against one of her teammates, most of that was gone. Hinata still won about half her fights, but there was clearly something lacking. She didn't exploit openings. Itaka was sure she noticed, hesitated in giving a finishing blow, and generally tended to be much more defensive than when fighting him. It was no wonder Shino and Kiba underestimated her. They realized that she wasn't weak, of course, but due to her behavior when fighting them, they unconsciously viewed her as much weaker than she actually was. Unfortunately, her performance in the spars against him didn't change that either, because it didn't look as impressive to them as it did to him. After all, he could still easily block and beat her, making for an outwardly boring match. He had briefly considered acting as if she gave him more trouble than she actually did before discarding that idea. Kiba and Shino both knew that he was much stronger than all of them, so such an act would only appear fake and unconvincing. It had taken a bit for him to understand why Hinata was acting the way she did, but once he did, he chided himself for not seeing it earlier. The reason she held back and hesitated was that she was afraid of hurting her opponents. It wasn't entirely unreasonable. The gentle fist could easily inflict internal damage, intentionally or not, and especially spars between a Hyuga and a non-Hyuga regularly ended with a short trip to the hospital. Moreover, Itaka knew that the only reason why more clan intern spars didn't end the same way was that many Hyuga knew medical ninjutsu and could take care of most wounds themselves. And Hinata, being obviously very aware of that herself, wanted to avoid that. Her hesitation at the academy had been marginal, probably because she hadn't really used her clan's fighting style and thus knew that there was no true danger, and when fighting against him, she was confident that she couldn't touch him no matter how hard she tried anyway, and consequently didn't care to hold back. But against Kiba or Shino, them, she could hit, and she didn't want to risk accidentally hurting them more than intended. So, with that in mind, the only attacks she actually went through with were those she knew would hit as planned and would do nothing more than immobilizing them. She meant well, and it was a nice sentiment, but unfortunately one very unfit for a kunoichi. In some ways, it reminded Itaka of himself. He had never liked violence, had always hoped for a kinder world, but as he had been born with exceptional talent during times of war, the world itself had been quick to drown that trait before it could truly sprout. It had never truly vanished for good, of course, but by the time he graduated the academy for the first time, he had been so well versed in suppressing and ignoring it that it just as well could have. Hinata, on the other hand, had neither been born in an abnormally violent era nor with outstanding talent, allowing her to keep that trait to this very day. Whether that was a blessing or a curse was anyone's guess. And now it was Itaka's job to make sure that it wouldn't result in her death. That meant he would need to have a talk with Hinata soon, but for now, he would focus on letting her teammates realize the true depth of her abilities. After all, they would be essential in helping her grow as a character later on, and for that, they couldn't view her as someone she was not. To do that, Itaka had decided to organize a joint training session with another team. Watching Hinata beat someone, or at the very least pull off a good fight against a person whom Kiba and Shino knew was stronger than them, would surely serve as a wake-up call. Especially if Itaka helped them along to come to that conclusion. All he needed was to find a team that had someone on it who was not only strong enough to qualify for that but also was someone Hinata wouldn't hold back against. Thankfully, finding a fitting team had been easy enough. One team with the perfect opponent for Hinata had actually just returned from a mission, and after a short conversation, their sensei had agreed to a joint session between them. Even better, the other members of that team could potentially help the two boys on his team with some of their other problems as well. For example, It had become abundantly clear that Shino was very frustrated with his taijutsu skills. It hadn't appeared to be a problem at first, but as his teammates' skills rose, Itaka would need to be blind to overlook how envious Shino was of their success. Oh, the Aburame didn't show it or let it affect his behavior towards them, preferring instead to hide the emotion deep within him in the same unhealthy way Itaka suspected he did with everything else he would rather ignore, but it was clearly there. It was foolish, of course. Comparing himself to two heirs of clans that had their own specialized and famed taijutsu styles when he came from a clan that focused more on mid to long-range attacks was bound to end in disappointment. Furthermore, Shino's own skill had grown tremendously over the last few weeks as well and only appeared subpar because he judged himself against his teammates specifically. However, even when Itaka tried to tell him that, it had been clear that he didn't truly believe it. Thus, the cycle of being disappointed, becoming frustrated, and bottling these emotions up continued. Itaka thought one particular member of the team he had in mind could help Shino out with that, but if not, he would need to take some more extreme measures before Shino's mental health deteriorated for real. Then there was Kiba. He too had a problem with his emotions, but unlike Shino, it wasn't that he suppressed them but that he let them control him too much. For one thing, there was obviously his guilt and consequent protectiveness towards Hinata. As mentioned earlier, this led to him jumping into situations without any regard for himself whenever he thought he needed to protect her, resulting regularly in his defeat. That particular problem would hopefully soon be resolved, but the underlying source would still be there even then. And it didn't stop there. Kiba was proud of his skills and not shy about letting that be known. With Hinata holding back in their spars and him being better in taijutsu than Shino, that meant he had grown somewhat arrogant over the last few weeks. It hadn't gotten too bad yet and limited itself to boastful comments and the likes, but it could become a problem in the future. It didn't affect Hinata very much as he had designated her as someone to protect and thus tried more to impress her than to elevate himself above her, but it clearly bothered Shino. Their teamwork hadn't suffered from it so far as Kiba hadn't actually claimed out loud to be better than his teammates yet nor belittled either of them for their supposed lack of skills, but Itaka was sure that Shino, who already struggled with what he perceived as his lacking taijutsu skills, would at some point snap even if Kibas only indirectly and probably even unintentionally insulted him. It most likely didn't help that Kiba, in an attempt to hide his still existing insecurities about being less ambitious than his teammates, had taken to shouting the most ridiculous claims from becoming Jonin within the year to even becoming Hokage in the future whenever he felt he hadn't done well enough during training. The joint training session would hopefully help with that as well. It wouldn't stop him from being an emotionally individual, of course, but it could help him realize that being in control of one's emotions was more beneficial than the other way around. Understanding is the first step towards improvement, after all. However, all these thoughts made Itaka frown. Now that I think about it, their teamwork might be great, but it's truly on a knife's edge. It would take only one of them to step out of line for everything to collapse. With them being a team for barely 3 weeks now, that was obviously not very surprising. Annoying, but expectable. If anything, he would say they did much better than what was generally expected from fresh genin. They had their flaws like everyone else and lacked maturity and experience to easily overcome them, but the potential was there. It wasn't easy to coax it out of them and training them was different from training Sasuke or even Naruto and Haku, but Itaka found that he truly enjoyed the challenge. Shisui and Izumi have been right, he thought with a small smile. Accepting the Sandame's offer has truly been the right decision. Who would have thought that training a bunch of children would be so exhausting? With every passing day, Kakashi's respect for his late sensei for dealing with his Obito's shenanigans with as much patience and understanding as he did grow even higher. In all honesty, they had probably been even worse than his current team. At least his charges actually liked each other while he and Obito had always been in each other's hair. The thought of how exhausting it would have been if his team were to constantly fight with each other made a shudder run down his spine. Kakashi really shouldn't complain. He knew that. No matter their shortcomings, his team was as good as one could hope for from a bunch of Green Academy graduates. From what he had heard from Asuma and some of his other colleagues, most teams had at least one troublemaker of sorts in their teams, and even if the fact that they successfully absolved their instructor's test meant they must have potential, that certainly didn't make their behavior any less annoying. The only other team he knew of that worked as good as his own was Itaka's, but that wasn't too surprising. Where Kakashi had tried to vanish in the background and don't stand out any further in order to let his fame die down, Itaka's exploits were still fresh in everyone's mind, and as the Uchiha's successes kept coming, so did his fame continue to grow. Of course his team would be in awe of him and act obediently like well-trained pups. Although he would never admit it out loud, Kakashi was almost a bit jealous. And thinking of Itake, well, don't get too eager, Sasuke, he chided the boy without taking his eyes from the orange book in his hand. Your opponents will use it against you if you overextend yourself like this. Then, to bring that point home, he slapped the incoming fist away, resulting in Sasuke losing his balance and stumbling to the ground before he caught himself. Unfortunately, this led to him standing in the way of an incoming Naruto who couldn't stop in time to avoid crashing into him. The two boys rolled over the ground in a ball of limbs a second later. Naruto, he called out while calmly turning to the next page. You're usually more alert than that. Don't tell me you're already tired. To be fair, he had ordered Naruto to arrive at the training ground 2 hours earlier than his teammates to let him do some endurance training. After all, with how much stamina the boy had, the only way to truly push him was to give him additional exercises. Kakashi was just about to open his mouth for another mocking comment. These two, and Naruto in particular, really needed to learn not to let themselves get riled up so easily when the whizzing sound of an incoming object caught his attention. However, what was much more important was actually the sound of a piece of paper flapping in the wind that accompanied it. A second later, the place where he had just stood was engulfed in an explosion. She really doesn't know how to pull her punches, does she? All three of his students stood out in one way or another, and they fit surprisingly good together. First, there was Itaka's younger brother. As was to be expected, the boy was a prodigy who also benefited from coming from a family that trained him from a young age. While it wasn't to the extent he himself or even Itake had been trained due to the fact that there was no war to fight, Kakashi would need to be blind not to see the clear signs of someone correcting Sasuke's forms and techniques, and from past conversations with Itake, he also had a pretty good idea who this someone was. Thanks to that, he was ahead of what was expected from fresh and even experienced genin in taijutsu, genjutsu, and ninjutsu. All he truly lacked was the experience and maturity to grow and get over his hero worship for his brother, and that would come in time. Kakashi's job would be to make sure the boy lived enough for long enough to actually have that time while refining his techniques even further. Then there was obviously his sensei's son. He had tried to avoid thinking about him too much over the years, limiting himself to occasional checking up on him while otherwise ignoring his existence. It wasn't until a few years ago, when he finally began to get his shit together again, that he considered approaching him, but he discarded that idea quickly enough. It was clear that the Sandaime intended to keep Naruto's identity a secret, so he had no good reason for approaching the boy. Not that that stopped Jiraiya from doing so, mind you. Having one of the Sannin spent so much time with the boy was hardly subtle, but as the Hokage tolerated it, Kakashi had no reason to complain. Maybe he only used that explanation as an excuse to avoid thinking about the past, but he didn't care. As long as he was happy, that had been enough for him. He still looked forward to teaching him, though. As far as he was concerned, teaching his sensei's son was the least thing he could do. The boy was clearly talented and had also benefited from having trained with Sasuke and, more importantly, Itaka for years now, and it showed. Skill-wise, he had clearly loads of potential. Once Kakashi managed to make him take things more seriously and stop rushing into fights without a plan B, he was almost guaranteed to be great. After all, no matter how clever or unorthodox his strategies tended to be, there was never a guarantee that they would actually work. And last but not least, there was the civilian girl. While clearly not as strong as her two teammates, Kakashi had been surprised by her, well, special approach to things. Technically, she wasn't outstanding. Yes, she was clearly intelligent and her genjutsu skills were admirable for a fresh graduate, but her ninjutsu and taijutsu was only about average. However, as always, you aren't holding your punches, are you, Sakura? She wisely didn't compromise her position by replying, but he had the vague feeling she was spotting a proud grin right now. Furthermore, by the time the smoke from the explosion had disappeared, Naruto and Sasuke were both gone as well, leaving Kakashi all alone in the clearing. Kakashi sighed. What a bunch of troublemakers. As it turned out, Sakura didn't understand the meaning of overkill. He attributed that to her heritage. Being the first shinobi in her family, she lacked the chance to train outside of the academy. At least very much, that was. Kakashi made his background checks and she seemed to train with some of her friends from time to time, at least. Regardless, there was a difference between training with agamates and friends on one hand and training with someone much more experienced who truly pushed you to your limits on the other. Sakura had never experienced the latter. When Kakashi told the three of them during his test to come at him with the intent to kill, Naruto and Sasuke came at him with all they had but also with the expectation that it would be ultimately useless. He hadn't thought about it much, being more interested in the fact that they didn't let his "only two of you can succeed" act affect them and even went out of their way to include their female teammate who didn't share a close friendship with either of them. It wasn't all that surprising, of course. They had trained with Itachi for years and thus knew from experience that no matter how hard they tried and no matter what tricks they came up with, the odds of their attacks actually injuring let alone killing him was basically non-existent. Sakura, on the other hand, didn't have this experience. Oh, she knew that he was stronger than them, but there was a difference between theoretically knowing something and having experienced something themselves. She, who had never fought a Jonin before, didn't have the bone-deep expectations to fail. So, when she attacked, she actually tried to kill him. Not out of malice or anything like that, no. She simply followed his command and that was it. In truth, Kakashi didn't think she even realized what she was doing herself. Having neither the experience of having been in real life or death situations before nor having grown up with the grim and not at all romanticist stories of shinobi life, she didn't realize what exactly she was doing. Not truly, at least. She wouldn't have used some of her far from mastered yet extremely deadly medical techniques that could easily kill someone against him who was supposed to be a comrade if she did. Almost against his will, he smiled. All three of them are interesting in their own ways, aren't they? In all honesty, training some newbies still sounded rather bothersome to him. Training Itachi's brother and his sensei's son caught his attention, yes, but he had been unconvinced that this would be enough to hold his interest for long. He had even considered letting them fail regardless of who they were. And yet, they somehow breezed through his test when everyone before them had failed, showed surprising amounts of talent, and even convinced him to give this a real try. Even now, several weeks later, Kakashi couldn't say he regretted that decision much. I wonder if this is how you felt, Minato-sensei? Yes, maybe this hadn't been a mistake after all. Check the description for the links to the author.